chums, you join me once again for what I hope will be the last instalment of our local election coverage, at least as far as live results coming in. We might end up doing a recap in a day or two once all the dust has settled. As we arrive back, I'll just screen share this in a moment, and then I'll bring Mr. Tom Williams in, who's waiting in the wings. As we arrive back, we have just hit 400 councillors for Reform, 162 for the Tories, 159 for the Lib Dems, 51 for the Independents, 40 for Labour, and 35 for the Greens. The Tories have suffered over 350 losses so far. Labour have lost over 100 as well. I sound like a robot. Ah, shit. Okay. Am I a robot again?
You do sound a bit robotic.
Ah, fuck. All right, hang on. Any better now?
Yes, it's a lot better.
There we are. Oh, well, what a waste. I did that whole little recap and I sounded like a robot. I'll do it again just twice as quickly. Hang on. Let me refresh this. So then, folks, Reform have over 400 councillors. The Conservatives are on 162, down over 350. The Lib Dems have put on over 60 on 160. The Independents are on 51, down 19. Labour on 41, down 113. And they didn't have that many to begin with. And the Greens are on 35, up 19. So continues to be an exceptionally good set of elections for Reform, and it's looking pretty darn healthy for the Liberal Democrats and the Greens so far as well. Mr. Williams, in the time that we've been away, have there been any council results that you think are noteworthy and worth taking a look at?
I would say Wiltshire Council is a potential one worth looking at, because Wiltshire, is particular North Wiltshire, has seen a huge loss for the Tories in an area of the country which should be like super duper pro. Wiltshire is the one just above Hampshire in the north.
In the north.
In the south, sorry, in the far south.
In the far south. Where's my?
It's where the Salisbury is. It's where Salisbury
okay.
is. There you
Hello.
go, Wiltshire.
Wiltshire. Oh, right. And I can't even click on it via that. That's useful. Surely I can click on it and it'll tell me the full results. Browse all council results. Here we are. Right, Wiltshire. Let's take a look here. Okay, so where we presently are with Wiltshire. So run me down what's going on in Wiltshire then, Tom.
Basically, you're seeing council areas in the north of Wiltshire which are very, very, very pro-Tory. Historically speaking, you're seeing the Tory party in those areas get reduced to third place in a lot of them. And the only reason they haven't totally collapsed is because they've held up relatively well in South Wiltshire. But Reform and the Liberal Democrats are making big gains in Wiltshire at the expense of the Tories.
I see. Yes, I mean, thus far, the Lib Dems and Reform have both put on 7 councillors apiece there. So we're about halfway through Wiltshire coming in. It looks like they're on track for no overall control, all things being equal. But obviously, I don't know what areas of Wiltshire have come in versus others. But that's what the numbers appear to show so far. Where else have we got councils for so far? We've done Lincolnshire. We had the mayoral contest in Lincolnshire. We've also got Lincolnshire Council. Reform have gained that from the Conservatives, up 38 from a standing start. And that's not even with it all declared yet either. Reform have already taken the council, and they've still got another 25 left to come.
Oh yeah, Wiltshire is like a sea of turquoise at this point. Like, it's just been completely overtaken by Reform, which isn't a surprise to me. Lincolnshire is the most right-wing part of the entire country, so it's an area where Reform would be doing and should be doing very well, and they are. So, not overly surprised by that result in Lincolnshire.
Okay, we're going to move over to Devon now. And this is one, obviously, where the Liberal Democrats are finding very fertile territory for themselves. They are on 27 seats. It looks like they're going to be just shy of majority control of the council, but I'd imagine it will be the Lib Dems in addition to somebody else, or even as a minority administration, just given their numbers. But nonetheless, this is an area that we'd said that we naturally would have expected the Liberal Democrats to do very, very well versus the Tories. And indeed they have, although you still have up 17 for Reform, nearly as many new councillors for Reform in Devon as there are for the Liberal Democrats here.
Yeah, that's the thing that was most surprising. People were predicting that Devon Council would go to the Liberal Democrats. They thought they would gain it from no overall control, and well, Conservatives, I should say. And it seems that it's gone from Conservative to no overall control because Reform massively outperformed expectations in Devon. Um, which is a very big surprise to me because Devon is not an area where reform should be picking up a lot of support. It's a very sort of leafy Tory area. That sort of area has always been a Tory with them battleground. So to see reform doing as well as they are doing in Devon is a really big surprise.
Yeah, I mean, if looking at the numbers from what it was previously, if you'd asked me prior to today how would it end up, I probably would have also said, "Oh yeah, the Lib Dems will probably take it." The fact that Reform are doing an awful lot better there uh, conforms with the pattern that we're seeing of these locals, really, which is generally speaking, even though we anticipated it was going to be a good time for Reform, they're doing even better than we'd thought. That seems to be the story of it. I mean, just looking at the total number of councillors at the moment, Reform already now are on 412. I mean, where could they end up topping out at now? I think we're easily past the territory of them getting 500 councillors, maybe on to 600. I don't know how much further they can go than that, but I think based on most of the predictions that I'd seen going into these elections, they usually had Reform somewhere 450 to 550, that kind of a range. It looks like they're going to end up doing even better than that.
I said a while ago that I predicted that Reform would get between 400 to 500 games, and from the way it's looking at the moment, even that seems to be an underestimate. Labour are keeping within my prediction of about 100 net loss of seats. That's what I predicted they would get. Conservatives are close to what I predicted they would get. I predicted a net loss of about 400, and they're getting close in that direction. I didn't do prediction for the rest of the parties. It was only Conservative Reform and Labour because it was difficult for the me to know where the other parties would go for the Liberal Democrats because Reform, in my view, was going to do so well that it was really hard to predict how anybody else was going to do other than them. And yeah, it seems to be a relatively decent result for the Liberal Democrats, and surprisingly quite a lackluster result for the Greens. The one that surprised me the most is how poorly the Greens have actually done. I didn't expect them to do incredibly well because the territory of these elections didn't favour them, but I expected them to be gaining more than they have done, and as we mentioned with mayoralties on the previous stream, really surprised they didn't win West of England. That was a big underperformance for them.
I'm perhaps a little bit less dour on the Greens, just judging from their numbers at the moment. They've put on over 50% so far. Wait, no, that's not right. No, they've doubled. They've more than doubled where they were presently. The amount that they've currently got, they've gained more than they were previously defending. So they've over doubled their councillors thus far. I wouldn't say that that's awfully bad.
Maybe I just had far too high expectations for them then. That could have been it, because the Greens in recent years have been doing very well, mainly at the expense of Labour. So maybe I just had too high expectations for them going into this.
But maybe. I mean, I think I'd say that the Greens are more or less where I'd expected them to be. I thought they were going to have it. The thing is that the Greens are obviously they're much smaller than say the Liberal Democrats or the rest of them. Now, on the one hand, you could say, well, that's no excuse. Reform had no councillors before, and look at where they are. But the Greens are they're a party that they grow slowly, but they grow consistently. I'd say that over the course of probably the last couple of decades, or at least the last decade specifically, you know, election after election after election, especially when it comes to council ones, the Greens sort of put them on and put them on and put them on bit by bit. But it is a general, there is a fairly consistent direction of travel for it. Certainly, they're not going to steal the show as far as the local elections go. But I think they'll probably be quietly pleased with how they've ended up doing.
We have
Um,
another update
yeah.
on a council as well, by the way.
Oh yes.
Nottinghamshire County Council shifted to Reform UK Gain.
Let me take a look at this then. Nottinghamshire County Council. Let's have a look at this one.
Yeah, Nottinghamshire for Gain from Conservative. Yeah, 33 Aldmar Ward, 33 Gain.
Did you say, "Oh my ward"?
No, I said on my ward, but on my ward is quite fitting considering we're talking about local elections.
You'd
Yeah,
mentioned the Ashfield Independents earlier as well, and they're here down 9.
yeah, they've crashed and burned by all accounts. Like, they've collapsed effectively because Reform just took all of their seats, which isn't a surprise because Ashfield Independents were Kipper Independents. They were a lot of them were ex UKIP people that defected to Ashfield Independents. So Reform was very easily going to gain a lot of them, and it seems they have done. And it's the usual case you're seeing across the country. Conservatives and Reform are just, I mean, Conservatives and Labour are just being decimated wherever you look. In fact, I saw a stat from Election Maps UK which showed that 70% of defences from both Conservatives and Labour are being lost.
Wow.
That's how poorly they're doing at the moment.
Well, just looking at these numbers here for just to show how different it is and how much better Reform are doing even than I'd thought coming into this, is I'd been thinking prior to the elections about how many seats the Tories would lose and then roughly what proportion of those that they lost would end up being Reform gains. I was obviously aware that Reform would win from elsewhere as well, but I was generally thinking about it in terms of as a majority slice of how much the Tories were losing. But here we are with the headline numbers at the moment. Reform 423 councillors. The Tories are down 376. So even if every single loss that the Tories have had was to Reform, and probably most of them were, that still doesn't even account for all of the Reform gains. Reform have gained more councillors than the Tories have lost. So it really does go to show that they're definitely coming after Labour as well, and probably to the detriment of other parties as well to a lesser degree.
Yeah, BBC are also reporting that by the end of this all, Reform will have a net gain of 700 to 800 councillors, which is double what my prediction for them would be.
Wow. I mean, I'm trying to think in terms of my predictions how they've shifted. At the very beginning of the year, I very much underestimated Reform. When I gave my little prediction video at the start of the year, I'd kind of said, well, I thought they might get 300 councillors, but then because some of the areas have been cancelled, maybe I'm not entirely sure. And then a couple of weeks ago, when I went back to revisit that, I sort of updated it, and I thought, oh yeah, I think Reform will probably get about double that. So thinking about 600 or so. But I've got to admit, actually, in sort of week or so run up to the locals, I did start to think, maybe 600 was a bit of an overcorrection. Maybe I was then overestimating it slightly. But indeed, where we appear to be, it looks like Reform are going to just completely supersede that. I mean, it's very much nailed on now that Reform are by far going to come out as the largest party in this set of local elections. The interesting question, I suppose, is where the other parties will end up ranking in relation to that, because it's a tight thing between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives at the moment in terms of their number of councillors. Labour are probably going to end up in fourth, although that said, we're not that far away from the Greens overtaking them. Labour could end up in fifth unless there's some juicy little morsel of Labour votes out there that I've not haven't been visited yet.
Honestly, probably not. Like, I think that Labour will probably gain like a handful. Well, not even that, probably less than a half a handful of places from the Tories because of how badly the Tories are doing. But otherwise, no. Like they're basically guaranteed to have a net loss of 100 at this point because of how poorly they've done. It is a real question as to whether they'll come fourth or fifth now. There's no real chance of recovery at this point for them.
I'm gonna make a bold prediction. And I'm gonna say that Labour end up finishing behind the Greens.
That's a bold one.
It is a bold one, but I don't care if I'm wrong. I'd just like to see it happen. I think it'd be quite amusing. Yeah, I'll say that much. It's not what I'm predicting, but it's what I'm looking out for. It's what I would like to see. If Labour are going to get punished, I'd rather them be punished totally. And I think it will be quite a nice message for them if the Green Party actually finish above them in terms of the whole, you've abandoned your base. Should I take a few comments from the chat here since we started? So yes, Apollo had said about 700 to 800 seats. Gary Williams says we wouldn't be looking at a far right fascist. Why can't I say that today? Tom, do it for me.
We wouldn't be looking at a far right fascist surge if Boris had done his job on immigration and given a damn about people in care homes. That's what the Gary Williams guy said. When he says about care homes, what do you mean by that? Do you mean like the COVID situation where a whole bunch of people passed away in care homes during the COVID pandemic because of very poor policy around care homes during the pandemic?
Or are we talking about social care more generally? I would imagine Boris, obviously relating very much to the COVID period, probably to do with that. And I think that's a fair point. So certainly on immigration as well. I think that the Tories probably would hold a lot more ground still with a lot of their socially conservative voters if they'd actually managed to lower immigration rather than massively increasing it. I will take slight issue describing them as fascist. I wouldn't do that personally. I think fascism is something a bit stronger and more distinct than what reform currently adhere to be. But nonetheless, I don't find their brand of right-wing populism my cup of tea either. We'll do
By
a
the
few
way,
more.
there's been
Go on.
another. Kent's got some more results come in for it. Liberal Democrats gained a seat off Tories in Kent. Tory vote fell by 33%. Labour's down by 13%. Reform surged by 30%, and Lib Dems are up by 20% in Canterbury North in Kent.
Let me have a look for Kent's on here. We'll go full results here. Right, yeah. So what we've got on here for Kent at the moment? Reform on 31, up 31. So I mean, I'd say it appears Reform could take Kent's council as well. They're not miles away from succeeding in that.
No, and it's the type of area that they would do well in because Kent, back during UKIP days, was an area that UKIP got a lot of support in. In fact, I remember one of the seats that Farage stood in back in the day was South Thanet, which is in Kent.
I find this quite shocking, by the way, Tom. Conservatives down 33 on one, complete collapse.
Yeah,
Why?
this is what's being repeated across the entire country. You're just seeing Labour and Conservatives being obliterated wherever they stand. I just haven't seen an example where that hasn't happened. Like I've said, I go back to that Election Maps UK stat where 70% of Conservative and Labour defences are ending in defeat for them.
That's remarkable, really. It really is. It's just a better time for reform, a worse time for Labour and the Tories than I'd anticipated coming into this at all. I'll do a few more comments quickly. John Cooper says, I think the Greens will do better in next year's locals, and Apollo TD agrees with that as well. Frank says Tories might lose over 2/3 of their seats. Lee Ball says still not over the Jack Daniels yet, Swiss. I'm getting there. Frank says reform have gained Lancashire. Apollo TD says saying reform are fascists will only show the leftists to be idiots and drive more people to reform. I mean, I wouldn't like to be in the habit of calling anyone idiots either, but yeah, you know, it's one of those things. It's I think it's too quick to, you know. I mean, I spent an incredibly long time trying to figure out whether I thought Donald Trump ought to be classified as a fascist or not, and there's certainly um he's got tendencies in certain areas. There's overlap there, but even then, I was slightly reluctant to say I think he's an out and out fascist in the way that we understand the word. But no, I think Reformer, you know, they're right wing populists, and we know what comes with that. But I think you need to allow room in order to be able to actually and accurately label people worse and more extreme on the political spectrum as what they are. In the same way that I think that you get your right wingers at time that are far too happy to band around the word communist to describe, like, social democrats or whatever. Lee Ball says, think about the needs of Kent and less about kneeling in Kenty cloth. That one's gone over my head. Frank says, Swiss, did you see GTA 6 got delayed to next year? Yes, I did. I posted in the group chat saying, can you believe that Kemi Badnock is going to get ousted before we get GTA 6 because it's been delayed until May of next year. Apollo says, my aunt just said, bring back Paddy Ashdown, otherwise I'm voting reform. Well, in the group chat, they'd said dig up Churchill before. We'll have to get Paddy back as well, won't we? Farage speaking now, says Apology D. Liebel says, agreed Swiss. I'm a fan of Bertrand Russell's need for accuracy of language. All right, where do we want to send our... You know what? It's amazing. Compared to the incredibly slow flow last night, every time I'm refreshing this page, the numbers are jumping up by another dozen or so. Where do we want to turn our attention to now?
I can't really think of other areas, but yeah, I've just seen the more.
Oh, but by the way, we are now 2 councillors away from the Greens overtaking Labour.
Yeah, and also in the short time that you refresh that page in 10 minutes, Labour has gone from net loss of 113 to net loss of 118 at this point. It's just...
Well, that's what I'm thinking with my rationale. Considering Labour and the Greens are so close to one another already, and arguably Labour are going to continue to lose seats overall, and the Greens are going to continue to make gains, I feel that direction of travel, they'll probably move past each other at some point.
Oh, I've got another area we can cover, Hertfordshire, because Frank has reported... Oh, no, wait, there's another place to go to before Hertfordshire, Worcestershire.
Okay.
Because Worcestershire, the Tories have lost that council to no overall control.
So we've got all of the seats of Worcestershire announced there. Reform on 27, so not far off control of the council there, only short by a few. Conservatives, not as completely obliterated as we've seen in some other councils, but nonetheless still very heavy losses for them. Greens have made some decent inroads there as well. Labour, nowhere, what was the other one? Hertfordshire.
The other one's Hertfordshire next, because Reform have gained a seat there in Hertfordshire off the Tories.
All right, let's go for Hertfordshire. Okay, so still early days in Hertfordshire. 6 out of 78 declared, according to the BBC. But so far, Tories down to Reform up to. You know what? If the Tories manage to keep to that proportion of losses and hold on to 2/3 of what they have, I think they'll be quite pleased for themselves in Hertfordshire. But I don't think they're going to have as good a time as that.
Oh no, Hertfordshire's only getting started with how bad it will be for Conservatives there.
What about our other mayoral races? What have we got left to come? We've got Cambridgeshire and Peterborough.
Yeah, the only one left we've got is Hull and maybe Peterborough. Cambridgeshire was a Tory gain. They won that.
Yeah. Well, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough there. Tory gain, you say? From who? Labour?
Might have been the Lib Dems, or maybe there was no gain there. But either way, I know that there was. It
Was it
doesn't say who gained it.
It wasn't an inaugural one, was it? Because I know we had a few inaugurals today
Oh, it
as
might
well.
have been. That's what I was thinking of
Right.
then. But no, I've seen the result. Oh, the Lib Dems did significantly worse there than I thought they would. I thought that would have been a Lib Dem Tory two-way race, but it was Reform Tory two-way race.
Hmm. But the Tories will be able to point to at least one mayoralty they've managed to win there. So Hull and East Yorkshire then. That's this is the final one that we've got. What's the
Yeah,
background for this one? Have we got any expectations going into it?
this should be an easy reform gain because the local candidate Reform have picked is actually quite a good one. He's apparently, from what I heard from Farage, an Olympic gold medalist who is a bit of a local hero in Hull. So he should win this. And to be
Yeah,
honest
yeah.
with you, he probably will because the only other person I think that could challenge him is Labour, and well, look at the state of the Labour Party at the moment. I think it's fairly likely that this will go to Reform.
Okay then. So in all likelihood, where we'll end up with at the end of all this is we'll have three Labour defences, a Conservative council, and probably a couple of sorry, not council, a mayoralty, and a couple of Reform mayoralties as well. Although some of the ones that Labour have held have been very much skin of the teeth affairs there.
Oh, and by the way, it's we found out who used to be the mayor of Cambridge, Cambridgeshire in Peterborough.
Oh
It
yes.
was Labour. It was a
Ah.
Conservative gain from Labour, which is a real surprise.
Oh. Oh. Well, something's got to buck the trend, I suppose. Eh? Is that going to be the one that the Tories managed to point to? You know that in every set of elections, no matter how bad it is, there's always one result that you can say, look, there's some areas we're doing okay. Is that going to be the Tories' saving grace where they go, well, we took the mayoralty off of Labour?
Yeah, funnily enough, I suspect that mayoralties will be what the two parties will point to in their propaganda efforts in the coming weeks because mayoralties are the only area of these locals where the two parties have done relatively okay. At least they did better than expectations. So I suspect you'll hear a lot about mayoralties moving forwards.
That makes sense. Yeah, if it's the only bit of good news that they've got, then that's the thing they're going to be pushing, isn't it? All right. So in total, we have 10 out of 23 councils declared now. And in terms of the overall numbers of councillors we've got here, I'd say that we're approaching about the halfway mark, I think. Or maybe we're already past it. I'm doing a little
Yeah,
bit of quick
quite
maths and adding
close.
them together. 100 odd, 150, 320, 520. Oh, no, over. Yeah, maybe 3/5 of the way. Let's say that 3/5 of the way in terms of councillors, maybe. I'm still waiting on that Green Labour overtake. We'll see whether it manifests or not. Maybe, maybe not. I'll do a few more comments from the chat here as well. Let's see. Frank says Reform gain Hemel Hempstead, St Paul's, Hertfordshire from the Conservatives. Tories lose Worcestershire Council. Lee Ball says yes, always cheering for those no overall control gains. Apollo says, when's the whole mayor results? Sorry, I can't join, by the way. I've been stabbed 4 times getting blood, and then again for an iron drop. I'm still walking back from the hospital. No worries. Take care, Apollo. Take care. Lee Ball says gain from Labour in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Also, Luke Campbell, 2012 Olympic boxing gold medalist, the one that we were speaking of there. And we have Mr. John Cooper waiting in the wings as well. Hello there.
Hello, Swiss. I'm back from the shops. Sorry it took me a while longer than I thought. But anyway, got a few comments on some of the stuff you were just talking about.
No problem. So, what was that? Sorry.
I've got a few comments on the stuff that you were talking about. In terms of the Cambridge and Peterborough mayor, remember, this was the reason why the Tories gained that from Labour, because in the last time that election was run, that was back when AV was, Tories technically came first, then Labour came second, but Labour won that because the Lib Dems tactically voted Labour in the second round. with their AV vote.
Oh, we've got an update on Kent Council.
So
The Reform Party have gained Kent, and the Tories have gone from 40 seats in Kent to 1.
so that's but yeah.
Can I
But
make a quick guess? I'll say this very quickly, just while it's on my mind, and I'll jump back to you. Kent is obviously the part of the country where all of these small boats are landing. That's probably got a factor in, surely. The fact that the Tories have been so utterly rooted there and Reform have done so incredibly well. That's the area that's seeing firsthand the effects of the illegal migration and boat crossings. So that's probably why I think it's such fertile ground for Reform. On top of the facts that that area of the country is generally speaking going to be good for Reform anyway.
Yeah, I suspect you're correct there. And there's also the history as well. This was an area where UKIP had a lot of support back in the 2010s. So it's largely the same sort of people who voted UKIP back in the 2010s voting Reform again this time.
Dylan Wilson in the chat says he loves my sunglasses, by the way. So much appreciated, Dylan. Go on then, John. Sorry.
But yeah, I was just trying to finish off with the Cambridgeshire thing. So the reason why Tories are gaining from Labour is basically because, well, the voting system has changed to like first past the post, and they normally come in first anyway. But with AP gone, let's see, they don't have to worry about, let's see, tactical voting of Labour, Lib Dems voting in one or the other for like second place. So they will probably win Cambridgeshire until maybe one of the other parties gets ahead of them in first past the post, at least in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So
speaking of Cambridgeshire, quickly, Frank's just said the Lib Dems are 5 seats from gaining Cambridgeshire Council. Not to be confused with the mayoralty.
So, yeah, that's kind of to be expected because Cambridgeshire is a very sort of
Lib Dem area.
Lib Dem area, basically.
By the way, in terms of some of the stuff from Hertfordshire, I did get a text earlier. I did see a message earlier that there was a council that in Hitchin that the Tories, I think, held, with Labour coming second, with Reform coming in third, but briefly behind. I'm not sure if that one's been announced yet, but the one you mentioned was a Reform gain.
The Lib Dems have also crossed 200 seats, and Labour are losing yet more councillors as they're now down 121 compared to 118 just 10 minutes ago.
Do you think it's possible that Labour will lose 200 councils by the end of this locals?
I don't think so, but I wouldn't be surprised. If that was to happen, that would be a catastrophe for them, because keep in mind that these locals took place in 2021 with the vaccine bounce that really benefited the Tories back then. They had the Hartlepool by-election that happened as well, which was another feather in the cap of the Tories and Boris Johnson. And so Labour were already starting from an extremely low point with these locals, and they should be making net gains, especially considering they won a landslide 10 months ago. If they were to be reduced, and they were defending about 250 odd seats here, so if they get reduced to double-digit seat numbers, that is just apocalyptically bad for them. Like, that is worse than the worst case scenario of the most cynical of people.
I think by the end of all this, they're probably going to be closer to 200 losses than 100, say, because it's not that much further they've got to go for that to end up the case. I want to do a comment real quick. Lee Hallam says, I would presume the Reform bits are East Kent and the Lib Dems are in the posher West. Can Labour get up into 4th place, or will they drop down to 6th? Well, I have been speculating whether the Greens will overtake them or not. So I am keeping an eye out for that.
Out of curiosity, if Labour's doing bad now, does that mean that the locals in the next couple of years until election, will they be even worse than these ones, or is this only going to be the worst year for them in terms of locals?
I mean, given that 2021 was a pretty bad benchmark for Labour to begin with, and they're doing poorly still compared to that, when we then get further locals, we're going to begin to get into the territory, I think, where Labour was starting to do a little bit better relative to the Tories a few years back. So actually, Labour are probably going to have even further to drop in the upcoming locals over the next few years than even we're seeing now.
The other thing as well is that next year we've also got Senate elections in Wales and the Scottish Parliament elections. And polling in Wales shows that Labour are due in for an even worse result than what's happening now. There's some polls that show that Labour could come third in Wales behind Plaid and Reform. And in Scotland, it's not much better. They could also come third there. I've even seen some polls show they might even come fourth in Scotland. So no, this year was supposed to be the good year for Labour. This was supposed to be their final good year of results where they had a net gain. And then every council election moving forward, they would get a bad result. The fact that they've had such a terrible result, starting at a very low point, is just incredibly bad for them. Oh, and they've also lost even more now, 125.
I mean, we're likely, the way things appear at least, it could still go either way between the Lib Dems and the Tories perhaps, but the way it appears at least, Reform and the Lib Dems are going to come out as the two largest parties within this particular set of local elections. Labour and the Conservatives might be in third and fourth respectively, or perhaps even Labour will finish behind the Greens. So it's remarkable, isn't it, that the two quote unquote main parties, as they have always been, are not only going to be pipped to first place, but probably pipped to first and second.
It reminds me of the old European elections where Labour and Tory were massively reduced in those ones as well.
Yeah. You're right, because that was the European elections were kind of the first and only ones where we saw the main parties doing so poorly, and now that seems to be filtering through to the locals as well, and you know, give it a bit of time, probably the national elections for that matter. I'll read a few more of our comments here. Claire King says, if Labour loses 200 seats, it's a complete disaster for Labour. They started with about 280. Lee Ball says, bad in opposition is not as bad in government. There's more blame coming Labour's way than 2021. And Lee Hallam says it will be worse because they have a lot more seats in urban areas. Yes. So, I mean, these contests that we've been looking at so far have been absolutely Tory dominated to begin with. But future local elections are going to be, urban areas. The Labour are obviously already going to have a big stacked up number of councillors in, and that's really where I think you're going to see a proper feeding frenzy for, I imagine, the Greens and probably some independents as well, taking from Labour, and of course Reform will do well because Reform are doing well everywhere these days.
Out of curiosity, you think later down the line we'll probably be seeing more of the Green and the Lib Dem gains, since they'll be urban areas, and Labour will have more losses towards them than Reform?
Well, I mean, the thing that's worth noting again about next year is I'll just go back to that quote I gave in the previous stream about performance for Labour, what Reform said. Reform said, if Labour thinks it's bad now, wait until next year when Wales is up.
Yeah. I mean,
out of curiosity, I might have mentioned this. Granted, this was probably in the first stream, and I don't think Tom was here at the time. But do you think if the Welsh results are so bad, there'll be calls for Keir Starmer or at least Rachel Reeves to go?
I would think that if it is as bad as people think it's going to be, if you have a situation where Labour loses like 500 or 800 councillors, something crazy like that, they get put in third place in Wales, they get put fourth place in Scotland, they just get completely decimated next year. If that happens, then I think you'll start to hear mumblings from people in the Socialist Campaign group, people even in the soft left of the party, who will be like, here is leading us to electoral oblivion, similar to what Sunak did with the Tories. We can't carry on like this, otherwise we're going to have less seats than the Lib Dems next time. He needs to go, and our party needs a fresh start. I could very well see mumblings of that beginning to happen next year if the locals' results are as bad as I think they'll probably be.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think that Starmer is still very much safe at the moment, even with these disappointing results. But if next year, especially with Scotland and Wales, is really that disastrous, then you could well see some moves against him. As for Kemi Badenoch, I think if I was being forced to say, she will be okay for the rest of this year, and it'll probably be the locals next year that she ends up getting ousted. But I do think that her position is much more vulnerable than the Prime Minister. Because the Tories, the Tories are a little bit torn at the moment, aren't they? Because on the one hand, they don't want to be seen as a party that is forever chopping and changing their leaders over and over and over again, which they've done multiple times over the last few years. But then on the other hand, by the time you're beginning to approach midway through the parliament and they've made no recognizable progress in rebuilding themselves, then they are going to start to think, well, surely we've got to, cut our losses and take a risk of changing course now, because it surely, if it seems writings on the wall that they're not going to do any better with Kemi Badenoch, then at that point they will think, well, we need to try someone else. And obviously, I know you're of the view, Tom, that in all likelihood it will be Robert Jenrick.
I can't see who else it could be other than him, because he's the only one that has the potential to at least stop the party from going into minor party status at this stage.
Out of curiosity, Tom, I recall you once thought that Penny Mordaunt might eventually come back and become leader, but I take it you no longer think this?
No, I don't think that anymore. She doesn't seem to be interested in returning at this point in time. She's gone to work for a tobacco company, so I don't think she'll be returning anytime soon. I also just don't think her politics would be right for the moment at this point. I think that for the Tories at this stage, this isn't even about winning the next election. I think that for the Tories at this point, this is an existential threat to them. This is about the survival of their party. Because not since the 1830s have they been met with such a threat as reform that could very well completely consume them and replace them as the opposition party to Labour. Because that's what's happening in these locals, where the Reform Party are dominating the Tories so comprehensively that there is a serious risk that if things carry on as they are, the Tory party could go the way of the Liberals back in the 20th century.
If I recall, the 1830s is when the Tory party became the Conservative Party, right?
Yes.
I'd like to answer a question that we've got in the chat here from Graspy Green, who has said, I just about understand your main election system, but how significant are these elections? Do Reform have power now? So yes. So I'm assuming, Graspy Green, you're from overseas somewhere. Yes, so obviously we have our national elections, which are to our parliament, the House of Commons, and that is which decides who is the government of the country, a majority there, and you end up prime minister if you lead the party. As far as these local elections go, as the name suggests, it is on a local level. It's authorities that have controls over cities or numerous groupings of towns or more rural areas, and their power is much more limited. Obviously, the main policy decision making still takes place in Parliament, but nonetheless, the facts that Reform have been shown to have gained a foothold in these local elections is, first of all, it gives an example of them in power. It now means that they are able to run some places and be seen to be in charge of some places. But probably more importantly for our purposes on a national level, it's showing us that what we've seen in the opinion polls is indeed being reflected in raw votes out there in the country, that there has been a big swell of support for Reform. And although we've still got a few years to go yet until we'll see that manifest in our national parliament, the fact that they are making such gains in these locals here shows us that that is indeed what the current direction of travel is. I hope that answers your question.
They're gaining ground where they can actually start putting canvassers and councillors to use in their national elections.
Yeah. I mean, these local elections as well. It's going to be a breeding ground for future reform figures and reform politicians. You know, they'll cut their teeth at the local level in the councils, and then further down the line, they'll, having had some experience, they'll probably end up moving into parliamentary careers.
So yeah, you'll probably have like the most competent and experienced councillors, maybe even some of the ones that have been elected today, running as MPs. Let's see, provided they don't get themselves into any scandals in the next 4 years.
It's more than just even that, to be honest with you. It also gives them a whole bunch of different benefits that a lot of people don't really take into consideration. When you become rooted within a local council area, you get access to a whole bunch of things like canvas data. You get local information on different wards and different areas that are sympathetic to your politics or sympathetic to your opposition, and you can form campaign groups and campaign strategies around that particular area to help you win. One of the biggest criticisms of reform, and one of the reasons why so many people until today vastly underestimated the party, is because they basically had no ground game. They had no canvas data to work with or anything of that nature. So they were essentially running around blind and hoping for the best whenever they did campaigning. With these results being as good as they are, they can spend the next coming years gathering and collecting canvas data that they can then use to help strengthen their campaign in the future, which reinforces their position and makes it more likely that they can end up winning both at the local level, but also more importantly at the national level as well. It's the same reason. It's the reason why parties like Tory and Labour were up until this moment so successful, and now with Reform gaining so much ground in so many different areas, there's a lot of different places that they can now work with in future elections.
I'd Hallam
Sorry, what?
says, remember, as well as Rayner's new councils will have elections too. Includes that those which were delayed from this year. Frank says, Reform have gained my ward. Lee Hallam also that Jenrick was the only realistic rival who didn't go off and sulk. Apollo says, Tom, do you think the Tories will become like the LR in France? The next GE could be Kim Campbell's Canadian Conservatives in 1993, Canada GE for the Tory party. Who are the LR in France? Just
the LR the LR are basically Les Republicains,
so
which
the French
basically
Tories, basically.
yeah, basically they were the French Conservative Party, which were very similar to the Tories. Ever since the 2017 presidential election, LR have essentially just faded into total obscurity in French politics. Originally, when the French Fifth Republic was created in 1958, I believe, it was dominated by two political parties, the Socialist Party and the Republican Party, and that
No.
remains the case up until well, apart from a handful of exceptions, up until 2017. And ever since 2017, with the rise of Emmanuel Macron and the Popular Front, as well as National Rally, the Socialist Party and LR, the Republican Party, have completely faded into obscurity. They
Yeah.
barely even get double digits in a lot of elections, and they are miles behind Macron's party, the Popular Front, and National Rally, which is the party led by Marine Le Pen and
Yeah.
Jordan Bardella.
Well,
So
sorry, go on.
so basically, the point that's being put here is, will the Tory party suffer the same fate that the Republicans suffered in France after the 2017 French presidential election? I would say it's not impossible at this stage, and it's getting to a point now where it's more likely than not to happen, because at this point, the Tories have got effectively no base left anymore now. The only people who are really voting Tory at this stage are farmers and extremely posh old people who just do not want any other party apart from the Tories to succeed.
And
And
my mum.
that's And that
and
base
and
of
John and John Cooper's mum.
and John Cooper's mum. But that base of support is extremely small, and as we're seeing, it's not enough to avoid complete obliteration. So if things carry on the direction that they're going, and if reform continue to legitimize themselves in the minds of the public as the only party that can be the effective right-wing opposition to Labour, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point, and more people who are still sticking with the Tories because they think they're the best alternative to Labour may decide to abandon ship and go completely over to the other side and join Reform. And so that's what I meant earlier by this being existential for them, because the more you have results like this, which are complete catastrophes for the Tories, the more you're going to have people who are like, what is the point in staying in a party whose only that's at a complete dead end and whose only fate is oblivion? There's no point, and so people will jump ship to Reform, and you'll just be left with a small core base of support, similar to what the Liberal Democrats have.
I just want to say this quickly as well for the benefit of Graspy Green, if they're not overly familiar with our politics. Obviously, a lot of our discussion so far has been about the rise of reform, and the diagnosis here that Just in the chat brings out. They say, "What's worse, keep on the same path with Labour and the Tories failing, or break the mould?" That does identify a real dissatisfaction with Labour and the Conservatives, and a real yearning for change, and a feeling that the two main parties have not been good stewards of our country over the last couple of decades, at least. But as much as we've been focusing on reform, which is sort of the right-wing populist alternative, we are having support bleeding out to sort of left-wing alternatives as well. It's just a little bit more spread out. Whereas most of the and I know I'm speaking in very simple terms here of right and left. It is more complicated than that. But broadly speaking, if we're talking about reform as being the right-wing party of dissatisfaction and the one on the rise, the left-wing alternatives that Labour support and others are bleeding out to, you have the Greens, I suppose you could say the Liberal Democrats to a degree, and indeed some independents being elected in urban areas and cities as well. So it's less easily identifiable as the rise of reform. And by far, the rise of reform is the largest movement towards some alternative from the main two parties right now. But there is also a similar thing taking place on the left of our politics as well.
Yeah. I will just make some comment.
Go on, John.
Just want to make some more comments of what Tom was describing the Republicans. I think from what I've seen that the Republicans may have changed their names now and then throughout French, but they were generally the Tory party. And for the most part in French politics, has now been reduced to like third party support, as when Macron, centrist party, lost their majority in parliament, they were the party that backed them up at first, and arguably the only party that's willing to back them up in the current French parliament, even though at the moment it's not enough, which could end up being the case with like the Conservative Tories, where they end up being the third party that backs up reform if reform can't get like a majority.
I think if you want a good microcosm of how badly and existential the Tories' problem is at the moment, Devon Council is the best example of this, because I'm looking at Devon Council right now, and it's quite remarkable to see what has happened to this council. This area was a rock solid Tory council with a small amount of Lib Dems, and then you had what's the big city in Devon called again?
Oh, you're asking the wrong person here.
City in Devon. Let me just.
Exeter, that's it. Exeter City. So yeah, you have Exeter City, which is then Labour, a small scattering of Liberal Democrats, but mostly Tory. And then when you look at this year, the Tories have been completely obliterated. They've they've lost a massive amount of support to Lib Dems and Reform, and this is the problem the Tories are dealing with at the moment: is they're losing support to everyone. People who are liberal Tories see the direction that it's being taken in at the moment, shifting increasingly more and more to the right, and they don't like it and are going to the Liberal Democrats as a result. Reform, by contrast, are basically going back to the 14 years of Tory government where they completely betrayed every single promise that they made, especially on immigration, and going, look at what these guys did. They were liars and they failed this country. And if you elect us, we will do the job the Tories refuse to do, especially on immigration. And that message is attractive to a lot of Tory voters, and so they're shifting. And there's just nowhere for them to go that was beneficial for them, because if they go in one direction hard, they lose the exact opposite, and they need both of them in order to win a majority, but it's not possible to win both of them. This is why this problem is so existential for the Tories at the moment.
So, out of curiosity, since Tom mentioned, I think a bit earlier, that the Conservatives could end up being permanently replaced by reform, but I'm just wondering, will that be possible? Because at the moment, you could say reform's at their peak in terms of electoral performance, but
well,
this is
their peak so far.
peak so far. But once Nigel Farage goes, will they actually have someone that can actually replace him and keep them as the permanent right-wing party, or will they collapse and then the Tories eventually come over and gain their spot again?
I mean, I've described Nigel Farage vehicles quite a lot when we talk about UKIP, the Brexit Party, Reform. These are parties that are very much tethered to the personality and the political gravity of Nigel Farage, and we obviously saw what happened with the likes of UKIP once Farage was no longer in play with them. I suppose the big question is, can Reform build itself as a party structure to be something that can actually exist independent of and outlive Farage? And I don't have a good answer for that yet. I would say that of all of the Farage vehicles that have ever existed, Reform appears to have the best chance of doing that. But if Farage was hit by a bus tomorrow, I think they would lose a lot of their momentum. But obviously, where they end up in a few years' time is a different matter. I just want to take a few of these comments quickly as well. Kevin Logan says it's Chemigeddon. And a mention of Exeter earlier. Kevin Logan had said Brexiter, and I was actually going to make a joke, and he sort of beat me to it, where I was going to say, what would happen if Exeter seceded from the UK? What would we call that movement? Would it be an X-exit? But anyway, Just had said Reform versus Lib Dems in future, depending on variables and if any self-destruct. However, it would probably take a couple of elections to get there. I'm not saying that isn't a possibility, because I think a lot of the way we're thinking about things is still trying to frame things as going, right, who would the two main parties be? Because our electoral system generally reinforces and supports there being two main parties. But what's so interesting about recent years is that we really are seeing that diversification of what parties people are voting for. So it may end up, and I can't say for sure, I really don't know, but it may end up that we don't have ultimately two main parties for the foreseeable future. And actually, we do end up in a state of having 3 or 4 parties that are all vying for 20 or more % of the vote share.
If that's the case, I do wonder if there might be some sort of political alliances, because going back to French politics a bit, you know how Tom mentioned how both the Les Republicans and the Socialists collapsed, and then you're replaced by Macron's party and Le Pen's party. There is also like the French left, which at the moment, when the Socialists collapsed, were all scattered and fractured, but Mélenchon was like arguably the most successful. Then after a while, they decided to do a few electoral alliances like NUPES and all that stuff. And currently, with the current French Parliament, they are actually the largest bloc, where like the Socialists, Mélenchon's party, the Greens, and the Communists are currently working together. And they did, and due to some electoral alliance and tactical voting, they did become the largest party. So I do wonder if possible, UK might have similar alliances, kind of like how they attempted to do with the Lib Dems and Greens implied with 2019, but a bit more effective this time, since there's no Brexit thing to get in the way.
So is the question you're asking sort of whether we end up in a situation of alliances between the parties?
Yes.
I think that right now we're in the middle of a period of sort of transformation with our electoral politics, where we're going from one state of generally two parties into what appears to be a much more multi-party system. And obviously, at the moment, the political norms are still to say, we're not going to be doing deals ahead of time. We're standing for our own parties. Vote for us. If you don't vote for us, you'll get the ones you don't want. Blah blah blah. If the political landscape continues over the course of the next decade or so to be actually we really are in a multi-party system now and we're not going back to two-party politics, then maybe it does start to become more normalized, the idea of electoral pacts or standing under umbrellas together or stuff like that. But we're still we're still emerging out of the old way of doing things at the moment. So I still think that a lot of the parties would be very reluctant to sign up to that sort of thing right now.
You could potentially, in the long term, see a situation emerge where you have a political system similar to Sweden or France, where in Sweden and France, not so much France, but definitely the case in Sweden, you basically have electoral blocks. And the way that they work is a whole bunch of parties get together and they run under a block. And they stand as independent candidates and independent parties with the block name next to them. But when it comes time to form a government, they all agree to govern as one single collective block. That's what the Popular Front in France does, where they're a collection of left-wing political parties that all run independently of each other, but then when it comes time to government and being in the National Assembly, they all get together and work as a single block. In the long term, if the current trends continue and we move into a European style multi party system, I could see a situation similar to Sweden and France, where you get electoral blocks of the left and the right working together to form governments or to act as representatives in the parliaments.
I want to play slight devil's advocate towards the point I made just a moment ago where I was saying about us moving to a multi-party system. Is it also possible, though, that assuming we don't get electoral reform to some sort of a single transferable vote or PR or whatever, that because of the first past the post system, eventually once the dust settles and people have moved to their new ways of voting and the rest of it, almost like a rubber band that's been pulled, eventually we snap back again, and maybe the first past the post system ultimately does reinforce two parties to be the main parties over time. I'm just posing that out there, really. I'm not trying to say whether it will or won't happen, but it just occurred to me that I'd been very, very firm on saying yes, it's going to be multi-party politics, but in a way, the fact that that's emerging right now is very much counter to the electoral system that we have, isn't it? The electoral system is meant to reinforce two main parties, so maybe over time it could drift back towards that again. I just want to answer one more question here. Well, I'll read a few out actually because we've got some more comments. So Lee Hallam had said, I think you have to think that if Reform is the main party, leaders to replace Farage will emerge. Edward said, the question is to what extent did Reform underperform in total gains because they couldn't field a candidate in every seat? I mean, they fielded people in. I think they fielded more candidates than any other party in these elections. Actually, I think Reform were very, very close to fielding someone everywhere. Definitely more so than the others.
Yeah, the Reform, I think, fielded candidates in at least 96% of seats, if not 99% of seats. It was very much, they went almost
more than any other party for sure. Apollo TD asks a very interesting question. Would this fracture of our two-party system have happened without Brexit? I've got some thoughts on this for you, Apollo. So I would say that the fracturing of the two-party system preceded Brexit. It was already on its way. If you look at the results from, say, 2005, 2010, 2015, we were gradually seeing that lowering of the vote share of the two main parties and more parties beginning to get footholds and representation. Then what happened, funnily enough, is during the Brexit years, sort of counterintuitively, it shifted back again. You had Brexit as an issue. You had Corbyn's lead with the Labour Party. I think both of those factors, for a period of time, pushed people back into voting for the two main parties. But the overall direction of travel, I think, for a while now, has been away from support for the two main parties. But interestingly, with Brexit, as much as during the Brexit period we went back into supporting two main parties, Brexit may have ultimately accelerated that process of multi-party politics, because what Brexit did is it created dividing lines down the middle of parties that previously had not been divided along those lines. Traditionally, we'd always seen the separation between sort of left and right, economically left wing, economically right wing, or conservatism, or whatever. But then Brexit came along, and suddenly you found that in the Labour Party, 2/3 wanted to remain and maybe 1/3 wanted to leave. In the Tory Party, 2/3 wanted to leave and 1/3 wanted to remain. Yes, you had the likes of the Brexit Party being solidly leave and the Lib Dems being solidly remain, but the two main parties actually became quite split on the issue.
And it became very hard to hold their coalitions together.
I think in hindsight, looking back on it, and if we do indeed emerge into a multi-party system, I think that the 2005 general election will, in hindsight, be seen as one of the most significant elections in British history, because that was the election where I think, in hindsight, you began to see the emergence of a multi-party system away from pure two-party politics, because Labour's vote back then was massively hollowed out compared to how it had been in the decades previous. You had, before this current Labour government in charge, Blair's victory was the smallest amount of vote share for a party that won with a majority that big. He only got, I think, about 36% of the vote, but got a majority of 66 regardless.
35, you got 35.
35, yeah, so 35. Got a majority, 66 majority regardless. And you could see back then that how hollowed out the Labour vote was becoming. And then you had 2010 happen. You had the first coalition government since the World War II coalition government, because nobody got a majority. Then you had the 2015 election, where you had up until 2024, the smallest vote share for a winning party ever. Cameron.
Can I add a few examples just to the point you're making as well? Just in support of what you're saying. 2005 was, up to that point in time, the most MPs the Liberal Democrats had ever got in an election. 2010 was the first time that the Greens got representation in Parliament. 2015 was the first time in a general election that UKIP got representation in Parliament, as well as the Greens, as well as the SNP absolutely storming it. So you saw over those successive elections more and more of these minor parties actually beginning to get footholds and representation where they haven't had it before.
2015 would also be the election where someone besides Labour, Lib Dems, and the Tories got over 50 seats for the SNP. As at best, parties would get 10 at best. But go on, Tom.
You could also point to UKIP coming third in 2015 in terms of overall vote share, beating out the Liberal Democrats, which was another example of that. The only sort of time where you didn't have that happen was the very brief period of the Corbyn era, where you had a very strong return to two-party politics because of, as you mentioned on the previous stream, the push and pull factor of Corbyn, as well as the polarization that Brexit caused. But after Brexit ended, you went right back to multi-party politics again, as demonstrated by the 2024 election, which generated some of the most wild results ever in UK history. 5 Reform MPs elected, 6 independents elected, which is incredible because independents really struggle to get anywhere in UK politics, especially first past the post.
The only time I can remember an independent winning a general election was 1997, when that one independent won against a Tory.
Yeah, and Tatton because of corruption. But yeah, you also had that. You had the Greens win 4 seats. The Liberal Democrats gained 72, which was their best result since the 1920s. and you had the two parties, Labour and Conservative, both combined vote share of 58%, which is the lowest they've had in decades. So I don't think this multi-party politics is going away anytime soon, because ever since 2005, the only time we have not had multi-party politics is the Corbyn era and the
Mm.
Brexit negotiations, and that was it. So
And
unless something like that happens again, I think that we're just going to continue this path of electoral fragmentation and moving towards multi-party politics.
And the thing is that the Corbyn era and the Brexit era pretty much overlap each other perfectly, with the exception of maybe a year or so either side. But there's certainly a good chunk covering a couple of elections where those were both factors that weren't present in the politics before. And absolutely, the Corbyn, the push and pull factor, lots of people flocked to Labour to vote for Corbyn, lots of people flocked to the Tories to vote against Corbyn. And likewise, with the ongoing Brexit debates, you kind of had Labour as the umbrella for sort of like a softer Brexit and people who had previously voted Remain, and then you end up having the Tories as that for a harder Brexit and for Leavers, and then obviously with like the Brexit Party and the Lib Dems a bit further on the fringes of that Brexit debate as being ardently for rejoining and a no deal Brexit, you know.
Yeah, I'd probably also say one thing to also note that probably times a changing thing is that when the Liberals started collapsing, they were on their 7th Prime Minister. Now Labour's on their 7th Prime Minister.
Wait, Labour's on their what, sorry?
7th Prime Minister.
Well, this is our 7th ever Labour Prime Minister, is it?
Yeah, Keir Starmer.
Oh yeah, we've barely. I mean, in hindsight, we've barely had any Labour prime ministers in the last 100 years. We've only had 7.
That's because that's because in fairness, like there are, if you take like Tony Blair and Howard Wilson, you know, they got elected multiple times when they were in, didn't they? So they sort of they've sort of skewed the numbers towards themselves a bit. If they'd been chopping and changing leaders during those years the same ways the Tories had at the back end of their time in power, we probably would have had quite a few more Labour prime ministers.
Yeah, in some ways, let's see, Labour prime ministers tend to last a bit longer than Tory prime ministers when they get in. I think
it's also the case as well that Labour just very reluctant to get rid of their leaders for whatever reason.
Yeah. There's less of an impulse for regicide than with the Tories, isn't there?
I think it's part of the reason is to not cause too much political infighting, since normally, with the exception of like Corbyn, most Labour leaders get elected don't usually cause too much friction within the party.
And is it fair to say that given that generally speaking, you know, the Tories get into power more often than Labour does, I'd assume that when Labour finally do manage to get into power, there's been a substantial enough shift towards them that actually that particular leader who's leading at the time is probably fairly politically secure for a while. I mean, certainly in the case of Blair, and I mean, I know it doesn't quite work with Wilson because there was a lot of to and fro between him and the Tories back then, but he obviously led his party for a very long time. The Tories have held power better, though. The Blair period was the only long period in power. I suppose it was. What's been the longest unbroken period of Labour in power other than 97 to 2010?
Yeah, it'd be a mix of both. It'll be tied between Clem Attlee and Wilson's first run as Prime Minister, where
so there's really not so there's really not much precedent for it, is there?
So
Labour being
Attlee
in
was Prime Minister for 6 years.
By the way,
Wilson was Prime Minister for 6 years.
They've got they've got vote share. I've seen some of it. Labour's total vote share in this locals election was 16%.
Oh,
that's the governing party of the country. I know that these aren't areas particularly favourable to Labour, but still, you've got an election taking place where the party in power with a big majority got 16% of the vote share. That's incredible.
Hold on, 2019 EU elections, UK. Let's see. Okay, the only vote share I think that's worse than that was Labour's 2019 EU elections, where they got like 13% of the vote.
The only other example where I can think that was lower than that for one of the big two was when the Tories in the 2019 European elections got 8% of the vote.
Well, I mean, the 2019 European election should be studied as such an interesting aberration. Well, I say an aberration, or was it a sign of things to come? A period of such maximum discontent and the ultimate opportunity to protest vote. Essentially, I mean, hell, the 2019 EU elections, I voted for the Brexit Party, and I don't vote for Nigel Farage. But it was the ultimate opportunity to voice discontent and dissatisfaction, because it was basically a free hit of an election. You were going out and voting for something that was likely to be scrapped in the space of a year anyway.
Well, the way you're describing that, Swiss, if we end up being like the EU elections, you'll likely have Reform as the largest party, with Lib Dems as the second largest opposition, with Greens being like a very big third party, and, well, Conservatives and Labour being very small minor parties.
We could end up, well, I mean, I don't know where exactly the Lib Dems do end up in all of this. I think the Lib Dems have a little bit further to go before they're ranking amongst Labour, the Tories, and Reform. But they're on their way. They're in that direction. They're only a bit. They could be there in a couple of years if they carry on playing things the way they currently are. I'll do a few more comments that we've got in the chat here as well. The Tories, I know I read that one already, reminds me of 1997 spitting image when Labour won and Major let all the cabinet be PM for 5 minutes. I think I've seen that clip, actually. Lee Hallam had said 6 years being the longest period Labour have been in power continuously, other than the Tony Blair and Brown government. Shockwave says Lib Dem reform two-party system. I know that's one that you'd put out there years ago, Shockwave, wasn't it? Lee Hallam says, Swiss, having already voted Brexit stroke reform, perhaps you should have backed Liam Bones for the set. Look, I already violated my principles by voting Lib Dem last year. I couldn't possibly vote Tory this year. Where would I be then, Lee? I'd be lost. Dylan Wilson says, now the question is whether reform can run these councils well. I hope so. And Claire King says, just think about it. 10 years ago, people thought we were dead. Yeah, that's true. The Lib Dems have risen like a phoenix from the ashes compared to their absolute punishment they received for going into coalition with the Conservatives.
Well, I think people just basically forgot that they, sort of did all those poorly planned policies decisions in coalition.
So where we currently are here, Reform are now well over 500 councillors. The Tories have managed to top 200, and the Lib Dems are on over 250. Labour, on the other hand, still within a hair's breadth of the Green Party at the moment. The Greens are tantalisingly close to Labour right now, but it's still not quite happening, pushing them into fifth. But we've still got another 12 councils left to go. So who knows where we end up. A few more here. Cameron Hickman says Reform gain badly south in Doncaster. Edward says, as Peter Hitchens says, the Tories and Labour are two corpses propping each other up. It's natural that the Lib Dems will be the second party if the Tories are replaced by Reform. And Edward also says, break out the Ed Davey takes on the map memes for 2029.
So speaking of Ed Davey, you think next election will be his last, or do you think he'll stay on a bit longer after that?
I don't know. I'd have to know the mind of Ed Davey, really. All I can say is, politically, in terms of his own survival, I think it's very much his own decision right now. He's led the Lib Dems to very good successes recently, and I don't see any reason why his position would be challenged. So I think it's very much Ed Davey's game of how long he wants to stay Lib Dem leader. I can't imagine any serious challenger coming along and taking over from him if he didn't want to be leaving. O'Run says, sorry, go on.
I do know that with at least nearly every time the Lib Dems will have had leaders in elections, or at least pre the coalition years, they had leaders that would at least do 2 elections before they were replaced one way or another.
I mean, the Lib Dems had gone through a period of changing leaders quite a bit. If you think sort of like you had after Nick Clegg in the coalition, obviously, you had Tim Farron, Vince Cable, I've forgotten the name now, Joe Swinson. But I don't think any of them lasted more than a couple of years.
Yeah.
So Ed Davies been quite long serving so far, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, more terrible results from Labour, as you can see. 100 down 133. Doncaster's counting their results now, and already you're seeing Reform making huge gains.
Shall we? I'll take a look at Doncaster Council. I'll bring it up on here so we can have a little look. If I can find where I'm supposed to be going. All councils, here we are. Okay, Doncaster, we have, yes, only 2 of the 55 seats declared so far, according to the BBC, but probably indicative of where things are headed. Labour down 1, and the Reform are up 1. Lee Hallam says, I presume it depends on whether the Lib Dems are in government. He would be 63 or 64. Yeah, we see. I was immediately about to go. Well, you know, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, but then I go, no. Actually, as much as the Americans have had very old leaders recently, in this country, we haven't really tended that direction. The oldest our leaders tend to get is their 60s, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the last 2 oldest leaders we had were Vince Cable and Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. Sorry. So what I should say then is the age of people in government, for that matter, that tends a lot younger, I'd say. Obviously, I think Theresa May and Keir Starmer probably the 2 that I could name that have been in their 60s or late 50s or early 60s when they've been in power. But besides that, you've had Sunak, a fairly young man, Truss, a fairly young woman, Boris in his 50s. Cameron fairly young, Clegg fairly young. I think Brown was in his 50s, perhaps. Blair quite young when he took over.
He was the youngest prime minister at the time until David Cameron took over.
Yeah,
I think he was in his 40s. Blair was when he took over.
So our politics has definitely trended with younger leaders in recent decades. The oldest we tend to get is so I suppose what Lee's saying is that as far as Ed Davies concerned, he would already be among the oldest of the party leaders possible to enter government if that's the position he ended up in. Average Joe says Starmer didn't show up to Runcorn by-election once. Some say it was a mistake or an acknowledgement Starmer would have made the situation worse due to his unpopularity. Thoughts? Well, when I'd heard that he hadn't turned up, I had thought it was obviously either for 2 reasons or a combination of both of them. Either that they thought that they would lose it and Starmer didn't want to be seen campaigning for a seat that they were going to lose, or that Starmer would be a net negative. And that him actually being there would put voters off. Although I'd also like to posit an alternative, which is that within the Runcorn constituency, there were actually 6 massive Starmer stands who absolutely love Sir Keir, and they were so disappointed that he didn't come and campaign, they stayed home and didn't vote, and that's why Reform won. So.
I think to answer Joe's question, it was both. I don't think it was one or the other. I think it was a case of Labour knew that they were going to lose that seat. Or at least the Labour leadership knew that they were going to lose that seat. And Starmer didn't want to be associated with a massive loss like that. And the other thing as well is I think that Labour realises that Starmer at this point is now as unpopular as Sunak was for the majority of his premiership, and that him campaigning in Runcorn would have just sunk the Labour vote even more. And so it was better for him not to go there. So I think it was both. I don't think it was one or the other.
I think it is quite remarkable, even just saying what you said there, which is that Starmer within the first year of his premiership is as unpopular as the Tory leaders at the back end of 14 years in power were just recently.
Swiss, I've got something to tell you. From what I'm looking for my local Labour, they've won Baldock and Letchworth North.
And where's that? Hertfordshire?
Yeah, Hertfordshire.
Let's take a let's move on back to Hertfordshire. We'll have a little look there overall. So Hertfordshire, all in all, we've got 49 seats of 78 declared. Lib Dems still out in front, Conservatives behind them, and Reform behind them. Hertfordshire, headed for no overall control, surely. I don't think anyone's far enough ahead in Hertfordshire.
Yeah, it looks it will be no overall control more than likely.
Yeah, to be honest, that was always kind of what we expected in Hertfordshire. The only question is, would we get we expected if the Tories weren't going to control it, the Lib Dems would be the largest party, and Labour would just try and get enough to try and get into coalition.
By the way, the numbers show now that the Greens and Labour are now joint 6th place or 5th place with each other now.
It's happened. It's happened. The crossover. I was wondering if it would happen, and we've arrived, boys and girls. Labour slipping into 5th place, or very close to, in this set of elections here. Wow.
Yeah, Dan has made a good comment here. He said, it's clear now Tories and Labour, as well as being bad in government, have spent more time chasing a small amount of Tory Labour swing voters, completely ignoring their base and other swing voters, which is part of why they've just been both hollowed out completely.
Yeah. Here.
I'll probably say for this, with the Baldock gain I just mentioned, what win they just got, that would be one of the few Labour gains of this election, by the way. So and it's a gain from the Tories. So it's just one of those fair rare ones. So I just wanted to bring that up.
I know, yes, indeed. Hallam has mentioned Labour in 6th place if you count the independents. Do we want to count? Is it fair to count the independents as a group when we're ranking all of these parties in terms of who's ahead of the others?
It depends on how you want to view the independents, really, because independents normally don't. They're not always politically aligned with each other, but as a bloc, you could say that they're doing well or poorly, I guess.
I suppose if we want to paint a picture of Labour doing really badly, then we'll chuck them in. If they finish behind the Greens, we'll chuck them behind the independents as well, just to really batter them with a stick and say, right, you finished 6th place.
By the way, I'm looking at Lancashire Council, and the appearance of Lancashire Council on the map is truly stark. Like, you've got Reform that have made gains of 53, and Tories have lost 40, and Labour have lost 27 in Lancashire. It's just total obliteration of the two parties.
I'll bring that one up on the council thing. So Lancashire, you were looking at, yeah?
Yeah.
That's where the Dilworths historically come from my research that I did in recent weeks.
Leicestershire's another one as well that was lost. That was Conservative and it went to no overall control.
So Lancashire here, all seats declared. Reform stormed it, 53 from zero. This is the thing as well, which I feel that in the recent years, we've got so accustomed to big political earthquakes and changes and swings that it almost is starting to, like, we're not really appreciating how wild it is that a party is coming from zero to suddenly take a council in the space of a single election.
Oh, not just a council. At this point, it's councils.
I mean, Reform are taking control of far more councils than I'd thought. I'd imagine maybe they'd get a small handful, but probably most would end up in no overall control. And instead, what we're seeing is actually Reform are getting themselves a pretty healthy number of these councils.
By the way, Dan's pointing out Kent was a total wipeout for the Tories. They went from like 40-odd seats to 1. They just got completely destroyed in Kent.
Reform are making more gains in Doncaster, says Cameron. Lancashire is traditionally Labour. Tories stormed it in 2021. That was an upset. Average Joe says, in some unrelated news, King Charles is going to do a King's Speech opening of the Canadian Parliament, not been done from a monarch since 1977. Oh, that is quite interesting.
I think
Quite
that's when
juicy.
Canada completely gained independence from Britain and became a sovereign state as well.
Look at us strengthening our ties with the Commonwealth, eh? And obviously part of that's got to be to do with I feel in a way that Canada has become a more prominent country recently. In part, I suppose, with their ongoing sort of conflicts isn't the right word, but you know what I mean, with the United States. I feel that we are thinking about and talking about Canada an awful lot more than we ever did in the past. Yes, Reform won every seat they stood in Lancashire. Spycatcher BBC says, I'm so happy this channel came up in my feed. Great intelligent coverage, chaps. Well, thank you very much. Much appreciated there. This is why I love elections as well. We get new eyeballs on the channel, and God knows that doesn't happen for most of the rest of the year. Alrighty, let me refresh. Oh, I don't know if you heard that, but I just had a very loud motorbike going by there.
Yeah, I heard that.
Edward said, better than the telly coverage since Dimbleby retired. And Apollo says, yes, King Charles, surely a power move by Carney to annoy Trump, bring back the empire. I have noticed that we really are utilizing King Charles politically, or politically maybe isn't the right word either, but what I mean is you've got King Charles going over to do the opening of the Canadian Parliament, which hasn't happened since 77. You had the invitation of Donald Trump for a state visit and from the King, which was meant to be a big coup, but then right after that big blow up with Trump and Zelensky in the White House, you then had Zelensky come over to Britain and met King Charles, and I think that was seen subtly as well as a little bit of a, not quite a snub to Trump, but, to kind of say, yes, you know what, we have invited you for a state visit from the King, but we are chums with Zelensky. And when he comes over, he can meet the King anyway. Very, very subtle little messages being sent.
I think it's because the royal family is by far the most recognized and currently most popular still of international force for when it comes to British figures, because our governments have sort of become a bit of a joke, but the monarchy is still very well liked, partly due to many of the years of work that Queen Elizabeth has done, as well as now what her son is continuing.
Would you say that King Charles is being used, as the monarch in sort of diplomatic and political ways? Is he being used differently than Queen Elizabeth was? I don't know whether partly I'm biasing that with knowing that Queen Elizabeth obviously was very old towards the end of her life and maybe wouldn't have been going around the place doing the same things that King Charles was. But it feels that in the short amount of time that King Charles has been on the throne, he is being thrown into the arena a little bit more than Queen Elizabeth ever was. Average Joe says that King Charles is prepping the ground for the upcoming Canadian War of Continued Independence. Zardos says this is potentially the biggest quake in forever. We're entering new territory, boys and gals. The game is really going to get interesting. I think if anyone's hoping this is another 83, they're going to be upset. And Lee Hallam says the Queen had to meet all sorts of people. Yeah, I know that the Queen, obviously as head of state, as the monarch, she was forever going around meeting people, as an extension of our sort of cultural power. Liberal Zardos also says no, Liz was doing the same back in the day. Okay, fair enough.
I think
perhaps I've got a bit of a recency bias that sort of, the Queen was quite advanced in years in terms of
let's see, in presidents, the only one she didn't meet at the time of her reign was, I think, Lyndon B. Johnson.
Edward says no, we had 11 X1 here. Saudi guy MBS. The UK government uses them regularly for perceived interests at the time. XI, no, Z. Sorry, President Z. I was reading Roman numerals there. We had Z. Perceived interest at the time. We had Z because back in the Cameron days we were trying to align with China on trade. Don't forget the Queen's EU hat. Yes, Z. Yes, I got it. Don't worry. All right, Labour and the Greens still on 60 apiece here. We have 9 councils left to declare. We're getting there. The light is at the end of the tunnel, guys. I think that we could be fairly. Oh, I don't know. What do you think? Maybe another hour or two, and we might have it all in.
Sorry, what's this?
What?
What was that last thing? Was just
I just said I think we're probably like an hour or two away from all the results being in. I don't think we're too far away.
Yeah. I think I think the ones that I mentioned from Letchworth might come in soon and update the map, which should add Hertfordshire's Labour to up to 3 because they won Bulldog and Letchworth North. Let's see, they lost Letchworth South. I think that was I think it was lost to the Lib Dems. But to be fair, that was Tory last time, so it'd be a Tory defeat to the Lib Dems. Letchworth North was arguably the tightest in the county council because it's like last election that had 46% Labour and 45% Tories, but now and then the Lib Dems were like 10% or something. But now you've got like Reform and Greens in, so that sort of divided and split the vote a bit more.
Which council we're talking about here? Sorry,
Hertfordshire.
Hertfordshire. We'll come back to Hertfordshire again. Where are we? Ah, yes, indeed.
Oh yeah, they've added a new one. Let's see.
Edward in the chat says, I miss the absolute exhaustion of overnight results. That's how men did it. Absolutely right. Quite right. You know, back when we were a real country with real men, we counted all of our results overnight into the wee hours. And now what is this? This woke waiting for the next day to count the results.
To be fair, that's been the result of locals. Let's see, every election. It's only like the general elections where they're counted over all at once at night.
Don't let facts get in the way of a good meme. We can push our talking points about the need for facts. Everyone else does it these days. Lee Hallam says Labour just holding the Greens off. Oh yeah, Labour have just put a nose ahead of the Greens now. 63.
It's neck and neck between Greens and Labour.
It's still in play. It's still in play. Whether we get this really is absolute levels of spite towards Labour at this point, that I'm just wanting to see them do the worst they possibly can. It's like, okay, they're having a bad time. They might as well have the worst possible time, just for our own entertainment. Liberals Ardor says, is Reform still at 35% national vote share? I can't get an update. I will go on to BBC's live updates here and we'll see what the most recent numbers that they've given us for that are.
I suppose with these locals, Reform will go up by 5 points or something.
I don't think we've not got a recent update from the BBC on this. I'll tell you what. I'll have a look at. I'll go on the Wikipedia table for these local elections and see what they've got written in there, whether it's 35% or anything more recent. Do they have anything for us yet, or is it still being all filled in right now? No, it's still no. We haven't got anything from the wikis yet. Lee Hallam says we could have a look at the no overall control councils and speculate on who could run them. Oh, good shout. Okay, yes, we'll do that in a moment. Shockwave says, weren't the EU elections counted the Sunday after the Thursday? I can't remember off the top of my head, but I don't know.
The EU elections were on the 26th of May, which is the same my birthday and Corbyn's birthday.
Are you and Corbyn have the same birthday?
Yeah.
Huh.
I found that out in 2018. Back during then, I was promising my mom I would not talk politics, but then I found out I had the same birthday as Corbyn, so I sort of geeked out. And my mom was like, "Oh God!" and even groaned more when her partner at the time pointed out that, "Oh, I also have the same initials." At that point, she was going, "Where did I go wrong?"
Well, speaking of Corbyn, funnily enough, I've got a comment to read about Corbyn in just a moment. Lee Hallam had said, shifty continental idea. Oh, the woke Europeans with their vote counting practices. We've also got a couple arrived at the same time, funnily enough, a couple of our long-time viewers who've popped up in the chat. We have Liberty Prime, who says, Swiss, long time no speak, been watching lots of streams after they've happened, only gotten the chance to catch one live. Well, it's very nice to have you here with us live, Liberty Prime, and I appreciate your viewership. And also Combin Spark, we remember Combin Spark, who says, hello, everyone. What do you think is the reason why the Greens are not as successful nationally in the polls compared to Reform? And do you believe rumours of Corbyn starting a new party is true? I'll start with the first one first. So why is it that the Greens are not having as widespread success as Reform are in the polls as far as an alternative to the main parties? Partly, I guess I'd say that the left generally is always more split. There's always more parties to choose from if you're on the left, depending what flavour of left-wing party you want, than the right. Traditionally, we only ever had one party on the right, and it's really a bit of a recent emergence that suddenly Reform's come along and trying to take the crown from the Tories. But I guess basically the Greens are competing against more other parties than Reform are, and probably also the Nigel Farage effect. Farage himself personally has a lot of political gravity to him, whereas the Greens have two co-leaders, Adrian and Carla something. There's less name recognition. There's less. It's yeah. That's my answer in a nutshell, I suppose.
The only way I'd see there being a third right-wing party if you've got like a sort of anti-Farage right-wing party, where they say like Farage isn't right-wing enough.
Look forward to the Rupert Lowe project of the future, whenever that ends up coming about. The second part of Common Spark's question: do you believe rumours of Corbyn starting a new party is true? I've not heard anything about that recently. Possibly you have and I haven't. But all I know is that for a few years now, there's been sort of murmurings about the idea of an alternative left-wing party that Corbyn would be involved in, or possibly more recently, him in discussions with some of the Gaza independents who are in Parliament about doing something with them. I haven't heard anything further about that recently. I don't know if any of you guys have or not, but to my knowledge, at least, it's remained just a sort of a possibility that's out there in the air, but I haven't heard of anything coming from it.
I think at the moment they will remain as the independent alliance, but I suppose if there's chance that more ritzy Middle East or Gazan independents, if you will, or those that, support Muslim rights or something, could be elected down the line. It could be they organize more into sort of an organized party just to be a bit more organized, have a bit more of a voice in Parliament when the situation calls for it.
We've apparently, according to Frank, we've got a national vote share that has been brought out, a national vote share projection. So I'm just taking a look for that. I've had a look on the BBC website. It's not on there. I'm looking on Election Maps UK's Twitter. I can't see it there either. Frank, if you don't want to link us, at least copy paste us. What is the projected national vote share at present? Edward says Warwickshire will be run by Reform minority because it's such a mess of party. Oh yes, that was the thing we were going to do, wasn't it? We were going to take a look at some of the no overall control councils and speculate on how things could end up with those.
Well, like I said for Hertfordshire, I think it's likely going to be Lib Dem led with possibly Labour and Greens and maybe some other small independents or something if they get elected to back it.
Let's see if I can blast. We'll try and blast through them as quick as we can. So we've got Devon. Okay, Lib Dem led. They've got a few choices. They could work. They could work with the Greens. They could work with. Who would they work with?
I think maybe they might. I think depending on how left or right, I guess they are. They might work with either Greens or Labour, I think.
There ain't any Labour there.
I was going to say there's no Labour there. How would they do that?
Okay, my
Just been
mistake.
ejected.
My mistake. I think they're likely to work with the Greens first, if at least possibly, but if not, they'll probably let's see whatever their second option is.
The Tories, I guess. The Green. I mean, I couldn't imagine it being Reform UK.
I think
I'd imagine it'd be the Greens and possibly the Tories at a push.
I think ideally they'll probably want to do the Greens because Tories, I think, my understanding ran Devon before. They don't want to work with the party that was just booted out. And I don't think they want to work with Reform just yet, as they're very opposed to reforming a lot of things, namely like how to handle the European Union. So I think, let's see, the Greens would be their first choice in Devon.
By the way,
we have the projected national vote share. So Polity D has shared this. Projected national vote share, Reform 30%, Labour 20%, Liberal Democrats 17%, Conservatives 15%, and Greens 11%. So hang on. So projected national vote share. So this is on the basis of these local elections. If these had been fought countrywide, how it would have looked countrywide. Is that kind of the gist of what it's supposed to be there? Because
I think so.
Because it's obviously what we're seeing there is very much counter to what we see in sort of like the national opinion polls. But then again, I guess people obviously do vote differently when it's the locals. But I suppose the takeaway at the very least from that is to say that Reform are quite clearly ahead of everybody else, regardless of who's in second, third, fourth, whatever.
According to what I'm doing on electoral calculus, if that result was done, the Reform would have a landslide of 371, so a majority of 102. Labour would be in opposition with 113 seats, their worst performance since, 1931. Lib Dems would be on 71 seats, only a net loss of 1. Conservatives would be down to 12, and the Greens would be up to 5. SNP 45. Plaid Cymru would be at 4, and the Independents would be up 1.
By the way, did you see the thing that Dan posted, Polo TD posted in the chat where they said what Farage planned to do as part of his councils, the ones that he controls now?
No. What's that then?
Oh, basically, Farage said Reform UK won't allow illegal migrants to be given accommodation in the new councils that they control.
Well, that's going to play well with the people who voted for him, I'm sure, especially in Kent. Now, the question is, does he have the authority to do that? Can or would the government supersede him on that?
I have no idea, but if the government does have the ability to supersede him, I suspect that will play quite well for Farage because he can do a very populist campaign and stand off with Labour and basically just paint them in a very bad light if that's the way they want to go down. I mean, I don't know whether they do or not.
Wouldn't that be more of a clash with the Supreme Court and all that?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know exactly which layers of government or the judiciary would end up. On what we're talking about, if we think about Kent, for example, which is obviously where a lot of these small boat landings are happening, and therefore I would assume probably the majority of people being put up in hotels and the like are, the fact that Reform have completely stormed Kent and now have full control over it, that's probably going to be the first major flashpoint for this policy, isn't it? Because people coming here illegally are being housed places, and I'm assuming a good bulk of those are in Kent. And obviously Reform now have pretty much total control over Kent. So we're going to see where that policy goes quite quickly. I want to do a few more of these no overall control ones here. So we have Gloucestershire, which is, this is like so close to the Lib Dems controlling it. I think they only needed like one more and they would have had it. So the Lib Dems have their pick. They'll have it either way. Even they could even run as a minority administration and they'd probably be fine. But we can point to the Lib Dems for that.
By the way, a couple of more things of note on that national vote share poll. If that was to be replicated in a general election, the Tories would have a grand total of 12 seats.
John Cooper just read out that same projection there.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, the other thing as well, is Doncaster might be worth checking out as well, because there's more results coming in from Doncaster that Cam is doing, and Reform is cleaning up there. Like Labour's getting decimated in Doncaster.
Oh
That
yes.
council will probably go to no overall control by the end of this.
I mean, obviously, I don't know which areas have had results and which haven't, and which areas favour whom. But based on the results thus far, if it continued on in that pattern, you'd have Reform with control of Doncaster. I'm guessing then, if that's not either your or Cameron's view, then maybe there are areas yet to come that would be less favourable to Reform.
I was of the opinion, because I spoke to Cameron about it before, Cameron was of the opinion that it would still remain under Labour control. I was of the opinion that it would remain under no overall control. The reason for it is basically because, in addition to typical Labour unpopularity, Doncaster Council is a very badly run council. It's quite corrupt, it's quite dysfunctional and broken from what he's told me about it. So I thought that they would lose it to no overall control, but if Reform actually managed to gain it, but then that will be truly historic, because Doncaster has been a rock solid Labour council ever since it was created. It's never been anything other than Labour. So if they gain control of it, that really shows Labour is in some serious trouble in their heartlands. And it will also link back to what James said last night, where Ed Miliband has got to worry about keeping his seat next time, because he may lose it to Reform if things carry on as they're going.
I mean, lacking any particular local knowledge of Doncaster, just purely looking at the numbers of what's in so far, it appears to me that Reform would be on track for taking it. But I guess we'll see where we end up. I want to do a few more. I'll do a few more comments quickly, and then I'll jump to you, John. So Peter Johnston had said the council has authority to prioritise housing any way that they want. Zardos says local authorities have quotas they need to house assigned by central governments. The sparks will fly, to say the least. And Edward says, I think that these elections are a turning point for Reform. One of the big things small parties struggle with is being seen as anything other than a protest. Reform will now be a possible government. Mr. Cooper.
I think I was going to say, I think also Yvette Cooper would be also in trouble because of how small her majority is, but I'm not sure where she is at the moment. I don't think she's in Doncaster right now.
Well, did someone say, was it one of you guys, or it might have been something I was watching earlier, but the Runcorn majority that was overturned in the by-election was actually larger than Keir Starmer's majority in his seat?
Yeah.
I mean, everyone's under threat at this point,
Yeah,
aren't they?
that's true. If Runcorn was repeated nationwide, from what I saw, the entire cabinet would lose their seats, including Starmer.
Wow.
Arguably, I think if Corbyn was still a Labour MP, he'd probably be one of the few safe ones.
Ironically, yes, he would be one of the few people that would actually be spared Labour wipeout.
It'll be just him and Diane Abbott, nobody else. Just the two of them there in London. I want to read one from Cameron here, who says Labour still won the mayoral. I expect them to have a majority of the seats. That's a fair point. Although, am I right in saying that as far as these elections go overall, generally I think Labour have done better in the mayoral contests than they have been in these council contests?
Yes.
Yeah, they have.
So even if we're saying yes, they got the mayoralty, that may not necessarily equal that they get the council. I mean, I obviously don't live. You know that place better than me, Cameron. But wait, Cameron doesn't live in Doncaster, does he? Does he live in Doncaster? No.
Close to Doncaster.
Close to Doncaster. Okay. I'm getting, you know what? I've been terrible this past day. Yesterday I accused Cameron of joining Reform, and today I don't even know if he lives in Doncaster or not. Cameron, I'm sorry. My deepest apologies. Edward says Cooper's trouble is the Muslim vote, isn't it? All that Gaza stuff should calm down by the next election.
You say that, but there might be conflict with US and Israel against Iran if you hear some of the talks going, and that might boost up. Let's see, so there could be more further chaos than just Gaza down the line. when it comes to like national elections.
Yeah, I'd say that the idea that it would calm down by the time of the next election, I wouldn't personally take that as a given. If you were to ask me in a broad sense, do you think that things between Israel and Palestine are going to get, better and calmer over the next few years or worse? I'd probably tend towards worse. And if you ask me that about the Middle East more broadly, again, I'd say more sort of hectic and unsettled. So I'm not entirely sure whether those issues are necessarily going to go away.
What I've heard, more countries are more annoyed at, I guess you could say, Israel's aggression, not just with Gaza, but with like other countries like Syria.
Well, I mean, with Israel, there was, rightly so, there was an immense amount of sympathy for Israel internationally after the Hamas attacks that had taken place, where they killed all those people and took all the hostages. And generally, I think there was a sense that Israel had to respond to that, and there was a general sense of support for their response. But in the time since, they've gone so far in things like blocking off aid and killing civilians and all the rest of it.
And not to mention casualties of the hostages as well.
Yeah, I think that support is starting to wane a little bit, to be honest. I mean, you only need to look about the fact that you've got that International Criminal Court order out for Netanyahu, So I don't know what the overall international view towards Israel is going to end up being, because obviously they still do remain an ally of a lot of Western countries and one of the few democracies in the Middle East, but it's becoming ever more unpalatable, some of the massive human rights breaches that are going on with them. Then again, it never stopped us being friends with the Saudis, did it?
No, I have heard talks that Saudi Arabia is becoming a bit more hostile towards Israel.
Lee Hallam has said Starmer's is a different sort of seat. I think Labour would have islands of survival in inner London and Liverpool.
I think that in Liverpool, yes, but I don't think that would be the case in London. I think that there would be a handful of places in London that would be okay for Labour, but not Starmer's seat, because he had a very strong competition from an independent MP, not MP candidate, that did far better than anybody expected they would do.
I think it was a former South African politician.
Yeah, and so I think if Starmer continues to be record unpopular that he is now, I think a lot of people in his seat would be galvanised to vote him out. And it's not the same as a place like North Yorkshire, where Sunak's seat is a place where they will just vote Tory no matter what. That would be one of the very few places the Tories would still be around in, even if they lost their position as one of the big two parties. Similar to how the Lib Dems are still around in the southwest of England, even after they stopped being one of the big two parties after the end of World War One. Another thing as well, speaking of vote share and how bad it's gotten for them, the projected vote share from the local elections is the lowest Conservative projected vote share ever in their recorded history. The lowest before that was in 1995, where their projected vote share was 25%. Labour matches its worst performance in 2009 at 20%, and it's the first time ever a party other than Labour and Conservative has topped a local elections projection.
Wow. And speaking about the parallels with the EU elections before, I think it may not have been 2019, actually. It may have been a previous one, but it was in the 2010s decade that we had the first time that any party other than the main ones had topped a national poll in the EU elections, and now we've actually seen that happen in the local elections as well.
Yeah, 2014, that was UKIP.
Gotcha. Zardos says, I think international waters overall are going to get more choppy. Yes. It would be a foolish person to bet against that. Edward says, if US-Iran kicked off, I wonder if that would trigger full sectarian voting in Muslim areas. I don't know. First of all, I'm not incredibly I've got a degree of knowledge, but I don't know an awful lot about US-Iranian relations and how things are likely to go in the near future. But also, as much as I know that there obviously has been a developing Muslim vote in this country, certainly that we saw at the last general election, I still don't know, especially to what degree it is, how widespread it is, what proportion it is of that population, if that makes sense. It's obviously been enough to put markers on the electoral map with a few independents, but I don't know quite how uniform I ought to be describing that.
I think it could be possible that you could get like widespread pressure on, let's say, certain governments and parties in like the West of not to get involved in the US's conflict, like Iraq.
If the United States went to try and get involved in another Middle Eastern war anytime soon, I hope we'd keep out this time, especially with this iteration of the United States.
Well, granted, the only big fear I can think of is Trump threatening to withdraw NATO support, saying, "Support me on this, or I will leave from NATO."
By the way, speaking of Trump and international affairs, Trump also announced a couple hours ago the US is officially withdrawing from Ukraine-Russia peace talk negotiations.
Oh, right after he signed that minerals deal with Zelensky.
Yes, basically. The US won't be taking part in any Russia-Ukraine peace deal negotiations anymore and is walking away from them completely.
I
So what does
suppose
that mean for Ukraine?
Well, the pivotal question is: are the US going to continue giving Ukraine either military or intelligence support? Because if they're walking away from the peace talks, in a way, that could be good for Ukraine. Because as far as the peace talks went, the US was putting far more pressure on Ukraine than they were on Russia. But if they're walking away from the peace talks, as long as they're still continuing to support Ukraine in their war efforts, then actually that's probably better for Ukraine than the current situation. So that's the real question, in my view. What is the United States going to do in terms of weaponry, intelligence, that kind of thing?
Trump remained ambiguous on that and didn't give a response.
Well, I mean, surely with the signing of that minerals deal, there must have been some. I don't think this announcement from Trump has come in a complete vacuum. There must have been some continuity of that thing has been signed, and now we're going to be withdrawing from the talks or something. There must be some kind of a view in the White House of what exactly they're going to be doing now. I mean, surely, right? Surely it wouldn't make very good sense if they've just signed this deal with Ukraine and then they say, right, we're stepping away from the talks, but we're also stepping away from supporting you militarily, and we're going to let Russia take over the country, because it would then mean that the deal that they just signed wouldn't be worth the paper it was written on anymore, because there'd no longer be a Ukraine. So surely there must be some element of them looking to preserve a independent Ukraine, because that would be the entity that would uphold the deal they've just signed.
You'd hope so, but you can never really tell with Trump these days.
No, he's not one for consistency or logic an awful lot of the time. But that would be my assessment, assuming we are dealing with slightly logical people.
By the way, we've got an update for Hull, the Hull mayoralty. The
Oh, yes.
East Riding half of the constituency has just declared it gives Reform's Luke Campbell a 9,000 vote lead over the Lib Dems, 10,000 over the Tories, and 18,000 over Labour. So, yeah, I think it's pretty much a guarantee at this point that Reform, that the mayoralty will go to Reform.
Yeah, looks like we're headed that way. A couple comments quickly. Lee Hallam says, all those years of trying and the Lib Dems never topped the locals. Interesting. Yeah, especially for all that we hear of the Lib Dems' local presence. They never managed to do what Reform have just done in a single beat. Jog says Reform are going to win Doncaster by the looks of it. Zardos says, Daddy Trump said he'd end it on day one. Not only that, Daddy Trump said there never would have been a war if I'd been in charge. Never would have happened. Joe Biden, what a terrible weak president. Joe Biden's war. Sleepy Joe. Yeah, surprise, surprise. Trump talks a load of shit. Who would have thought? Edward says, art of the deal indeed. Get the minerals and fuck off. It's the military intelligence that would kill Ukraine quickly, not like Ukraine is long for this world either way. I mean, that depends. I mean, if the US were to cut everything off tomorrow, weaponry, intelligence, all the rest of it, then yeah, Ukraine might be fucked. But the longer that they continue to support Ukraine in some capacity, especially with the intelligence, it gives more scope for the Europeans to be able to fill in some of those gaps rather than sort of like an imminent. But then again, actually, I think Tom, I think you're probably a lot more knowledgeable in this than I am. Where are we right now in terms of, you know, if America turned the taps off tomorrow, how would Ukraine fare?
Very badly, to put it bluntly. The issue with this war at the moment is it has transformed into a war of attrition, and a war of attrition is one that Ukraine simply cannot afford to have because they simply won't win it. They have Ukraine is badly desperate for everything, but in particular, they have huge manpower shortages and they are incredibly reliant upon US intelligence in order to conduct any kind of military operations against Russia. The loss of weapon support while keeping military intelligence would be very bad, but it wouldn't be a catastrophe for Ukraine. They could potentially make it to the end of the year, but it would be very, very difficult. If they lost intelligence and weapon support, then by the end of this year, I think you could very well see a situation in Ukraine emerge where they experience a collapse similar to what happened to Assad's army in Syria at the end of last year, where the entire military just completely crumbles due to non existent morale, no military supplies, and unable to see any kind of Russian counteroffensive coming due to lack of intelligence. So their fate is incredibly tied to the US at the end of the day.
And
They are the ones that will
especially
decide whether they survive or not.
hinging on the intelligence more so than anything else.
Yeah,
You know,
it's
like the satellite
military
systems and
it's
all of that.
military
Yeah.
intelligence that Ukraine needs more than anything else. Weapons is something that they do need, but it's not as critical as military intelligence. That is the one thing they need more than anything else. And so if that gets cut off, then they're in an extremely precarious situation.
We've got a few of the viewers appreciating the Trump impression there. Lossie Losnitzer says, you vote Lib Dem or Greens if you are confused and cannot pick between the Tories stroke communists bracket Labour. You vote Reform if you want good governments and the rule of law. I think I probably, considering that earlier on I disputed the labelling of Reform as fascist, I feel obliged to point out that Labour are not communists. I think, in the interest of fairness, I ought to cut both ways there.
As I mean, for the good governance point, I mean, we'll have to see. When UKIP was put in charge of councils and were councillors, they were a very amateurish operation. So I guess we'll have to see with Reform, but I'm not particularly hopeful with Reform's governance competency because of how
Farage
badly
parties work.
UKIP were that when they were in charge of their councils back in the day. If they do screw up councils, though, I'm not sure it'll make that much difference because the problem with councils in the UK is that they're so badly run at the best of times that even if reform do screw up, most people will probably just brush it off and go, "Well, what do you expect? Local councils are always shit. Who cares if they are if reform
So
are bad?"
basically, we probably have to wait until Reform gets into some form of government, either being largest party or junior party, and then they're terrible, and then that's when people start saying, "You lot are useless. Get out."
It will be the only way that would really happen would be. I mean, at this point, I'm of the opinion that the only real way that you can dethrone the momentum of populist parties in Europe and North America, minus Canada, is basically by giving them the government, putting them in charge and giving them responsibility, and then that way they oftentimes screw up and then people turn against them. That's seemingly the only thing that brings them down at this stage because nothing else works.
I've got a question here, slight devil's advocacy to the point that was being made a moment ago, but the whole sort of line of reform will get into power and they will be incompetent and shit, and then the voters will see and sour on them, whatever. That could be the case. And maybe if you're looking at sort of UKIP as prior for that, then maybe. But I also wonder whether or not that argument is kind of a form of cope coming from Labour, Tories, whoever else. The idea of, okay, sure, reform have completely obliterated us and they'll get into power, but you wait and see, they'll fuck up and then everyone will come crawling back. That feels like a little bit of a cope because
it more or less is in a lot of
know?
ways, especially when you look at the state of Labour and Tory run councils. I mean, look at the old Northampton councils, for example, which were bankrupted by the Tories because of them spending a shitload of money on vanity projects for building up the council building. Or you can look at Birmingham Council, which is just a disaster in every way possible. I mean, probably the worst run council in the country at this stage.
Can I just read the best comment? Can I just read the best comment we've received on this stream so far? From Russian flag Putin Master Rules here in the side chat, we've got, what's this garbage? I'm off. F this rubbish channel. Vote reform. Forget these Labour-loving non-sympathisers.
Anyway,
I
to
mean,
counter
it's
your...
funny how I'm getting accused of being a Labour sympathiser when every single person in the chat always says that I'm massively biased against Labour and are super miserable and cynical on them. It's funny how I'm being accused of a Labour supporter, despite that perception of me.
You haven't rejected the accusation of being a nonce, Mr. Williams. I think you should do that one first.
Well, yes, I'm obviously not that. There's not much that can be said. I'm not that.
Let's see.
But you know what? If the most scathing critique of this channel we've received has come from username Putin Master Rules, then I feel that probably we're doing something right as opposed to something wrong.
Well, to be fair, Tom, last time I've seen you positive anything Labour was after the Peterborough Borough election in 2019. But to counter Swiss's point of like the cope thing, arguably yes, if reform do terrible in government and then start losing locals, it might not necessarily go back to like Labour and the Tories. It could hypothetically move to like the Lib Dems or even Greens to some extent, as they're more like opposition parties that have not really full on been in government. Mm-hmm. Okay, granted, there's the Lib Dems in the coalition, but still.
Can I skim through a few more of these quick? Oh, sorry. Did you want to respond to that? And I'll do some comments.
I was going to just read what Liberals Ardos has said here. He said, it's a quote from Sir Humphrey from the old Yes Minister programme, which I'm sure everybody has seen. He says this: half the people in local government are your enemies, and the other half are the sort of people that make you prefer your enemies. I think, to be fair, that would generally sum up my view of local government. Like, I have an extremely negative view of local government at the best of times. So I would generally agree with that Sir Humphrey's quote there.
That, you know what, a lot like how there's always the thick of it quote or scene that can be applied to most situations. I find the same with Yes Minister as well. Right, I want to crack on with a few of these comments quickly. So there's an interesting one here from Josh T. I think the problem is Farage looks honest to low information voters because he answers questions. He lies when he answers them half of the time. Oh, hang on. I've got an alarm going off on my phone here and it's very distracting. Let me just That's it, right. I think the problem is Farage looks honest to low information voters because he answers questions. He lies when he answers them half the time, though. Starmer tries to avoid lying by not answering. It makes Starmer look less honest. Maybe he should just answer questions by lying sometimes. That there is something to be said for that. I think the fact that the traditional way that most politicians operate is that they are forever trying to stop themselves from being tied into being quoted for things that later turn out that they didn't do or that they U-turn on or blah, blah, blah. So they always use this very muddy, foggy language around the way that they answer questions. Farage is a lot more clear-cut and to the point and comes across a lot more straight talking, even if at times the things that he's saying aren't true, because the way in which he says them comes across as more authentic sounding than I think to people who don't necessarily listen to an awful lot of politicians or look beyond just sort of the headlines of it, do kind of go, oh yes, Farage is a much more honest talking kind of guy. I want to read a few more of these. Liberty Prime says the general consensus I hear from my way close to the North Tyneside region is that Farage is a horrible man, but he's the lesser of two evils. The country is sick of the Tories and Labour. Spycatcher says, regardless of the inexperience of the 600 new councillors now in place, how can they possibly do worse than the existing ineptitude? And I think these lines are really filtering into the same idea, isn't it? Which is to say, just the main parties, Tories, Labour, haven't been working for people, haven't been delivering for people. Standard of living, quality of life, people's aspirations have been going in the wrong directions. And no matter who you switch between, it never seems to do anything. Whether or not you personally like Farage and like his policies and think that he really does have a good program for government and has all the right ideas, or whether it's just a matter of, well, you know what, I've tried the other guys, how much worse could he be? It makes good sense in a way why there is such a shift away from the main parties, and Farage is the one more than anyone else capturing that right now. That sense of even if you're not fully on board with the Nigel Farage program and you think he personally is brilliant, it's just a sort of, well, send a message to the main parties or give the other guy a chance or what have you.
Well, to be devil's advocate of that, arguably, yes, the current councillors are probably rubbish, and that's why the reform ones have been elected. But the reform ones also have no experience, and for all we know, they could end up being worse than them. It's kind of like how, like in general, when you've got populist governments in, they take over after incompetent left or right centre parties, but then they also end up being bad, if not worse, than the parties that came before it. Like, let's see, like how Trump right now is causing absolute chaos in America and the world with his tariffs.
Mm-hmm. By the way, more updates on Doncaster Council. Sorry about that. More updates from Doncaster Council. So far, of the seats that have been declared, Reform have got 10, Labour have got 3, and the Conservatives have got 1. So you were right in what you said about the way the direction of travel is going in Doncaster. It looks like if things continue as it's going, Reform will win control of Doncaster Council.
I was just kind of extrapolating the numbers from where they were. Like, given the results that we already had when I looked at it, I sort of thought, right, if those proportions roughly hold true by the time all the results are in, then probably they'd end up taking it. I want to do a few more comments that we got here. Average Joe says Farage and Trump are honest liars. Lee Hallam says Starmer can lie with the best of them. I'm interested to pick up on this for a moment because obviously it's a truism in a way that politicians lie. But there are differences in the ways in which they lie. Certainly the emergence of Donald Trump, he lies in a different kind of capacity to the ways that we've seen other politicians lie. It's kind of like I'm only plucking a few examples here, but Donald Trump will stand on a podium and say something that is out and out factually incorrect. He can just make something up out of his head and say that it's true, and he will keep sticking to that line. Whereas I think other politicians, in the way that they've tended to lie, often it's kind of it's skewing things slightly, or it's misrepresenting things slightly, or it's saying you're going to do one thing and then doing another because circumstances have changed. But the Trump lies are often completely counter to what reality is. whereas the traditional way that politicians lie is usually the way in which they or we are going to operate within a similar sort of shared reality. Is that I'm finding it difficult to articulate what I'm trying to say, but do you feel that's kind of one way of putting it, or do you think I'm splitting hairs too much here?
I think at the end of the day, with Starmer and Farage and what degree they lie, I would say they both lie in many different ways. I think with Starmer, it's indisputable that he completely lied about every single thing that he claimed to represent in order to get elected as Labour leader and to eventually be elected as Prime Minister. Like, does anybody remember the 10 pledges that he
Oh yeah.
did when he was leader of Labour?
Oh
Broke
yeah.
every single one of them as if it was a checklist. That is an example of him just being a fragrant liar when he was in as Labour leader, which is also another reason why I knew he'd break every single one of his promises when he got in, because if he's not even willing to keep his pledges when he's Labour leader, why would he keep his pledges when he's Prime Minister? It doesn't make any sense, does it? And that's exactly what has happened. He promised change. He hasn't delivered any of it. He's the only change he's made. He's changed the Labour Party into the Conservative Party, which I'm not sure that's the change which people voted for back in July. And his constant dodging of questions, his refusal to take positions on anything, and his flip flopping really annoy people to amazing degrees. With Farage and the way that he often lies is that the way he lies is basically he'll make an extremely exaggerated point which has a very small degree of truth in it, and then when it gets proven wrong, he basically just acted as if he never held that position in the first place. Like Brexit was a good example of that with something like NHS funding, where he sort of made the argument that implied NHS funding would go up, although he didn't make that 350 million ridiculous claim that Boris and Michael Gove made. But then when the Brexit vote happened, he said, "Oh well, I can't guarantee that NHS funding will go up." It's like, well, that's convenient, isn't it?
I think that Boris 350 million lie was probably one of the more Trumpian-esque lies that we've had in our politics, because it was something that time and time again was proved to be an incorrect number, and yet Boris stuck to it rigidly regardless and kept hammering away at it, even though we knew it was false.
Yes.
I'll do a few more of the comments that we've got here. Jaden Taylor says, why can't we stop criticising the new councillors before even giving them a chance? Liberty Prime says, my experience of councillors are that they're shit and can't run anything. Ideally, we'd have business owners who can actually run things and have a tried and true record of making things work. Lossie says, reform has a big learning curve for how to run a council and how to be in a seat. Spycatcher says, I suspect that new councillors will be resistant to corruption. That's a big deal. They'll also be in tune with wastage and inefficiency. And then there was another one I wanted to read, but I might have skimmed past it. It might have been a little bit further up. It was, yes, earlier Lossie had said, the most important thing is that you voted and live by your own morals. I will say this much, dear viewers, for whichever parties that you vote for, I am a very strong believer in going out and voting, even if you want none of the above. At the very least, go out and spoil your ballot, because it at least shows a level of engagement there. It will be there forever in black and white on the figures to say this this is one more number in favor of one person, or one person said I don't want any of the rest, because otherwise you just disappear into the crowd of the non-voters and the turnout percentage that was never there. So I'm absolutely in agreement with you on the importance of going out and voting.
By the way, we've got
Yep.
results for two areas, Hertfordshire and Hull East. Hull East, Reform won the mayoralty. That's being reported by Guido Fawkes. And for Hertfordshire, well, I don't know what the full results are out, but I don't know what happened with Hertfordshire, so we'll have to look it up.
Frank is saying Libs 31, Cons 22, Reform 14, Labour 5, Green 5, and Independent 1. Judging by that result, you're probably going to get the Libs with the Greens and the Labour forming a coalition, maybe with the Independent as well. So you've got probably a Lib council, and that'll be the first non-Tory led council in 24 years in Hertfordshire.
Yeah, so basically, Hertfordshire, the way that ended up breaking down in the end was, oh yeah, we got the count there for mayoralty and Hull.
Traffic light coalition.
Yeah.
Greens, Labour, Lib Dem.
Yeah, traffic light coalition in Hertfordshire, but yeah, it was no overall control in Hertfordshire, which I don't think was a change. But Liberal Democrats will probably end up ruling with Greens and Labour in the end, so that's that.
The council that time, the Tories had a majority last time, but it was reduced from last time.
Oh right, so in that case, it's from Conservative to no overall control in Hertfordshire.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
I feel like we need to dedicate a few more comments read out to Starmer lying, because there have been a fair few viewers that want to focus on that one as well. So we have Starmer is a snake. Starmer is the biggest liar by omission I've ever seen, but a lie of omission is still a lie. Everyone simply has had enough of the Blair airy spin. And Starmer, he simply pretends he didn't say or do things. He has one principle, his own career. There we are. Who says we don't have an interest of balance here on the channel? But we'll do Starmer as well as Farage and Trump. Ryan Adams says, I feel that if you don't vote, you can't complain. Yeah, I agree with the principle of that. I feel that you want to be engaged with what's going on. You want to say that you've at least taken part in it, and that you've had an idea of what you want. Or yeah, and at least spoil your ballot. Or in my case, as I've started doing in recent elections, vote for the person you like, but that you know isn't going to win, and then you can be completely blameless in anything that happens after that. Hallam says, I don't know why I've started calling you Hallam all of a sudden, Lee. Lee Hallam says, NHS spending is above $1 billion a week higher than it was in 2016, and it's still shit. Edward says, those new councillors won't be resistant to corruption. They just won't know how to do it yet. Spycatcher says, did anyone forecast this amount of reform candidates getting elected into local government? I did some investigation and got varying guesses, but nothing even close to this number.
No, nobody predicted they would get that. I was the person who predicted them the highest of anybody I know and have seen, and even I thought.
Oh, Tom, I've lost you there.
I was going to say, I was the only person who gave them any kind of a high number, and even then, I only gave them 500 councillors, so they far exceeded my expectation. Reform exceeded basically everybody's expectations. The people who are the most embarrassed from this result, in my opinion, is the New Statesman. They predicted that Reform would only gain about 330 councillors, and believe it or not, they thought that Labour would have a net gain in councillors. The New Statesman's prediction was so incredibly bad that it was like on par with like Ann Seltzer polling in Iowa, where they said Kamala Harris was going to win, and then Donald Trump wins the state by 15 points. Like, it's that level of bad, and it's the type of failed result that you get so badly that it destroys your credibility as an organisation.
So, in other words, no one would trust the New Statesman in terms of polling, at least.
Well, nobody should, but whether people will or not is anybody's guess.
For my part, with predictions for these locals, at the start of the year, I'd maybe thought in the ballpark of about 300. A bit later than that, I'd updated it to saying now probably closer to double than that, so i.e. 600. However, I think in the week or so leading up to these locals, in my own mind, I'd thought somewhere in the ballpark of 450 to 550. So I'd still vastly underestimated it as well, given how much we've got left to go. Apollo TD says 35 watching, but only 9 likes. Thumbs up for the stream, guys. Look, there we are. And if you've got more comments about politicians who lie, we'll read them out for you if you drop us some likes. So go for it.
By the way, there was a more in common poll that came out which showed the reasons why people voted for reform, and basically the number one reason was immigration. 81% of people who said they voted reform did so because of immigration. The next reason below that was I like the leader, which basically is Farage, 31%. And this is the interesting one. The one that came third was crime. That was the third reason why people voted for reform, crime. The reason I say that's interesting is because one political issue, which I feel has gotten more or less barely any coverage recently, is crime, which I find interesting because a lot of crimes, like fraud and shoplifting and crimes like that, have actually gone up massively, but it seems like it's almost never talked about as a political issue.
What about, let's see, you think that one reason that might be with reform is because they thought like they will lock up the grooming gangs and all that stuff, since that always ends up being a news headline or something?
That's possibly what people are thinking of if they're voting reform for crime reasons, yeah.
I just want to respond to a comment here quickly. Omega Croat had said, how do you think Starmer will respond to reform challenging them, and do you think he can beat them in 4 years? We covered that question in a bit more detail earlier on in the stream, but briefly to summarize, how will he respond to them challenging him? I think the view was that he was probably going to try and. I mean, Tom, you thought he was probably going to try and tack further right.
Oh,
Or at least appear to do so.
there's
Plainly.
no dispute about that because Morgan McSweeney has openly come out and said, yeah, we got to go more right wing to get the reform vote.
I think it had also been mentioned in the chat when we were discussing it that possibly one of the best angles that would maybe actually pull in both reform voters and voters on the left would be nationalisation, because you've got a sense of economic protectionism and nationalism on the one hand and a traditional sort of left-wing position there. But we were dubious about whether or not Labour would reach out and grab that one. Do we think that he can beat them in 4 years' time? I would say that it's not impossible, but it presently looks unlikely. That's the best way I can put it for the time being.
Spycatcher BBC thinks Starmer won't be the Labour leader at the next GE.
Again, possible. If Labour continues to do really, really poorly, then by the time they get midway through the Parliament, you might start to get some trigger-happy people who think about replacing him.
Someone has put out the seat number, the results for the local elections put onto like seat numbers. Someone's done the seat projection for that, and I'll read it as follows. This is just seats. Conservatives would get 7 seats if there was an election today or tomorrow. Labour would get 46 only. With Dems would get 87. The SNP would get 44. The Greens would get 7. Plaid Cymru would get 4. And Reform would get a whopping 419 seats. So in that scenario, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats would be the opposition to Reform, and the Labour Party and Conservative Party would be rendered totally irrelevant in British political discourse and discussion.
Crikey. Can I jump through a few more of the comments here, and then we'll come back to the results again afterwards. Election Maps UK had said got some new maps up. If you've not seen them, we will take a look at those in a little bit. Liberal Zardos says, the Andy Marr gang think Blairism is going to last forever, lol. Edward says left-wing polling in the US became comfort blanket polling, not comfort blanket polling, not about accuracy. Edward had said crime kind of linked to the immigration bit, whereas Blue Guy says getting tired of all the failures on problems being blamed on them immigrants. Lossie had said, I clicked a like because you pronounced my name very well. Lossie Lotsnitzer. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the analysis. Apollo says nationalised water. I will mention this much, by the way, because we've attracted a decent bunch of new viewers with our coverage in the past day or so. And from what I've gathered, quite a few of our new viewers seem to be reform supporters as well. So probably you will have gathered already that the sort of centre of political gravity on this channel is not overly sympathetic to reform. I'd say that broadly we sit on the left or the centre left. But the thing that I've always attempted to do, and I usually hold up to that standard fairly well, is that I don't want to, just paint with a broad brush and say that, my political opponents or people that disagree with me are stupid or idiots or bad people or any of that kind of thing, because I remember well enough during my time as both a Jeremy Corbyn supporter and an ardent Brexiteer just how much I disliked those kind of charges being thrown against me. So if you do end up sticking around on the channel beyond these elections, then you're more than welcome to do so. And we do, within our group chat off of this channel, have a sort of a coalition of people of all kinds of different support. Just be aware that obviously in our analysis, talking to one another, we are generally going to view reform as our opponents and be speaking about the prospects of how parties can try and defeat them. But nonetheless, I at least will treat all of you with respect here in the chat, as long as I receive the same from you. So welcome to the channel, new viewers. Where else are we? Lee Hallam says it's what people are concerned about rather than politicians are talking about. I don't think it's just grooming gangs, much wider than that. Josh T says I wasn't saying Starmer never lies, but he lies. But he tries to avoid lying by not answering questions. Farage and Trump unashamedly lie, but it makes them look honest to low information voters. Zardos says, oh, it's muggings, stabbings, burglaries, old Bill using resources by going after people for saying naughty things, and on it goes. Apollo TD says Rayner's seat is up for the locals next year. Very possible reform gains in her ward. Tupac asks, how is Doncaster coming along? How is Doncaster?
By the way,
Reform is basically speculated to just outright win Doncaster at this point. There was a ward in Doncaster which was super safe Labour, and it's
I'm losing you again, Tom.
There was a ward in Doncaster which had 3 councillors up, and all of them were Labour, and Reform gained all of them. And this was like a super safe Labour ward where they got a majority of the vote last time. So Doncaster Council is probably going to go to Reform. So that's another for Labour.
Reform are 8 seats away from taking control of the council. And we've still got another 35 to declare. Wait, no. 8 seats isn't right. That's not right.
By the way, Swiss, the only time, in regards to your comments about not calling the electoral idiots, the one thing I'd probably say is the ones that are the most foolish were those back in last year's US election that were pro-Palestine, who ended up voting for Trump because that was a massive conflict of self-interest.
Well, yes, and I would agree with you that that was shooting themselves in the foot to have voted the way they did based on that, given how things ended up turning out. But I just find it in at the very least in a rhetorical sense, when we're talking about politics and trying to convince people of our points of view, I think there's rarely ever anything to be gained by calling people idiots. You're only ever going to turn people off from wanting to listen to you doing things like that. What was I was trying to predict? So let me think. So 55 seats in total. So how many do you need in order to get control of half the council? It's 25 plus 3, 28. Okay, 13. Reform needs another 13 to take control of Doncaster. And there's another 35 to go. So I think they could take Doncaster.
By the way, there was a quite amusing thing that Farage said today in his little question-answer thing with journalists. He made a quite amusing point saying that the Tories and Labour are both trying to triangulate to the right wing in order to get votes from me, so therefore Reform is the centrist party now.
Reform's the what, sorry?
Reform are a centrist party now. That's what he said.
Who said Reform's a centrist party?
Farage did. It's an amusing joke. He said that because Labour and Tory are trying to go as right wing as possible in order to triangulate and get all of his votes, that means that Reform are now the centrist party and Labour and Tories are 2 right wing parties.
You see, I remember not that long ago Farage describing Reform as a party of the centre-right, and even at that point I was a little bit, come on, Nigel, come on. I don't think populist right is an unfair label for you. But then to say that they're the centrists, come on now. What?
But it is sort of lining what Tom said of like the centrist parties trying to pivot towards reform to get their votes is sort of normalizing their views, if you will, when instead they should be more in direct challenge to them, really, rather than trying to appease them.
I mean, I suppose that the case would be made that with labels like left, centre, and right, it's often relative. It's often relative to what the overall picture is, who supports what, and the centre would be the middle, the aggregates, the to a degree the commonly agreed upon ground, or something like that. But I wouldn't. I don't think I could endorse saying that Reform are a centrist at this point, because I think an awfully large bulk of our politics still sits to the left of Reform. I think that they are still fairly well embedded on the right. I want to take a few more comments here in the chat. In response to what I said earlier, greeting some of the new viewers. Spycatcher said, "I'm hard Reform." But I'm thoroughly enjoying this panel on this channel and their takes, especially the historical references. I'm a fan, even if you're a commie. Lol. Well, kind words, despite the accusations of communism, but I'd expect nothing else from a fascist.
I describe myself as either a democratic socialist or a left-wing social democrat.
I'd probably say social democrat for myself if I was going to go for a broad label there. Lossie Lotsnitzer says, "You are being very fair in your bias. It is hard to get out of your bubble." Edward says, "I'm an old viewer, not a Reform fella myself." Fair play then, Edward. I think I hadn't recognised your name unless you went by a different one previously. But what does tend to happen as well is that we do get people sort of pop up during election coverage that I maybe don't see on the channel much otherwise. So sometimes I'll confuse longer term viewers that I haven't seen in a long time for new people coming along as well. Sam says, "I'm Reform, but I'm enjoying that." Well, look at this, guys. Who would have thought? All these Reform supporters coming in and stomaching our criticisms. Jordan Taylor says, "Do the people in your call have similar views, or do you have some opposition in there?" Well, the particular batch that we've got in at the moment, I'd say that we all probably we're all kind of well, yeah, on the left. I'd say we're all probably kind of centre left. Perhaps you, John, a bit more left wing than me and Tom.
Yes, I'm probably the most left wing of the bunch, and
yeah, but
you're probably more in the centre, and Tom's probably more in between.
But as far as our sort of pool of guests goes, within our group chat, we do have a bit of variety in there. You know, we do have some Reform supporters. We've got some Lib Dems. I'm not sure if we've got any Tories, but that's kind of because there's not many Tories left these days. Everyone's kind of jumped ships.
We do have someone who used to be a Tory but has become. Interestingly, their view of the Tory party is actually similar to the direction that I took when I was in Labour, where used to be a strong Labour supporter, became completely disillusioned after Starmer took over, left the party, and gradually got more and more anti-Labour as time went on. And we've got a similar situation where someone's in there who was really pro-Tory, has gradually gotten more and more negative on them as time has gone on, and now just left the party altogether.
I've found from my experience, basically all of the Tories that I've known over the past few years within our group or extended family have either pivoted to Reform or the Lib Dems, one way or another.
Mr. Fielding would be the Tory to Lib Dem.
Indeed, and as far as our chat goes as well, we do have what I would describe as a chunky sort of hard left component to them as well. I don't know if they describe themselves as such, but if some of you guys in the chat are calling us communists, then wait until you get Josh on one day. Right, where else have we got to go here?
Or Stephen, who is an out and out communist.
Well, there we are. Yes, we're a broad tent coalition, I suppose you could say.
Would Chamchi be a communist, or is he not really in the chat anymore?
No, Chamchi's the landlord, so he couldn't possibly be a communist. let me do some more comments. I think I'm getting a little bit too hung up on outing the political views of our comrades here.
Okay.
Yeah, the only other thing is there's more results in from Doncaster, another Tick Hill and Wandsworth in Doncaster, another Reform gain, Conservative hold. We know where this is going. Like, Doncaster's going to go to Reform. Like, it's going to go from Labour to Reform. I think that might be. No. They had Durham Council. So I think this is their second council where they've gained it off of Labour. And the other one was Durham before that.
Yeah, we are on track. I think Reform only need 12 more now, so I think we can probably quite safely pin on that Reform are going to take Doncaster at this point. Which I think I'm right in saying Doncaster was the only Labour-held council of this bunch in this election, wasn't it?
No, there was Durham.
No?
Durham was also held by Labour, and they lost that to Reform as well.
Okay, fair play. Let me do a few more of these comments here. Zardos says, well, Captain and crew, it's been fun. Cheers for your excellent streams, but I must depart to the galley for dinner. Until next time, cheerio. Nice to have you with us. Apollo says, people aren't prepared for the social conservatism and nationalist mix of economics that will win elections from now on. Edward says, look at me. I am the centre now. Somalian pirate Farage to Captain Kia. I quite like that one. Lossie says, I was a Tory for 40 years. Reform is more what the Tories should be. Edward says, by the way, Swiss, I am an older viewer from the academic agent days. Always a fan, made a few of the deepest law memes about you. Well, I can only hope they were favourable. Ryan Adams says, I'm Reform, lol. Oh my God, is there anyone who isn't Reform in the chat? Oh, no, blue guy's there. I'm Reform, lol. There are a lot more of us than people thought. Today is proof. We have been called bots for the last 12 months. It appears we aren't. No, the only one that I'd call a bot was the Vladimir Putin master guy with the Russian flag who popped up earlier on. Spycatcher says, wouldn't someone with social democrat values have more in common with the Reform Party than any other mainstream UK political party? I wouldn't naturally think that. It depends whether we're thinking of social democrat in the same terms or not. But I'd view sort of as opposed to I think what Farage would be after. I think I'm more so a kind of a tax and spend type. I'm happy for there to be a state that operates things. I feel that Farage is a little bit more in the other direction, but then again, the waters have muddied slightly. You know, as much as I've considered him a bit of an old Thatcherite, he is willing to go along with things like steel nationalisation, for example. So it's not totally clear cut, but no, I yeah, maybe you've got a different view, but I view a social democrat as something embedded somewhere on sort of the centre left in terms of where its principles sit, and I think Reform is an entity of the right. There could be overlap in certain aspects, maybe. Blue Guy says, chunky left could describe a lot of people that I know. Average Joe says Luke Campbell has won, by the way. Who is Luke Campbell in today's context?
Hold on, let me look it up.
Luke Campbell is the mayoral candidate, Reform mayoral candidate for Hull. And yeah, Hull, Reform won the Hull mayoralty, which was to be fully expected. They won it easily. The interesting thing about Hull, though, is a little bit of trivia that's actually relevant to it, is that the candidate that came second was the Liberal Democrats. They were 8 points behind Reform. Which is very interesting because you'd think that given the way that Hull is, the Liberal Democrats would get nowhere, but interestingly enough, the Liberal Democrats actually have a very strong base of support in Hull, and they have done ever since 2010. And a lot of that basically comes down to extreme anti-Tory tribalism in that area. Hull is a very strongly anti-Tory area, and so when Labour was in its doldrums after the 2008 financial crisis, they wanted an opposition party to vote for, and the best opposition party to that was the Liberal Democrats, and so they voted for them. And because the Liberal Democrats are very good at entrenching themselves in a local area, that support was very strong there, unusually strong given the way the demographics of Hull is and the nature of it. So, yeah, it's quite interesting that you had a Reform, Liberal Democrat, marginal, relatively speaking, in Hull, of all places.
So, do you think that'll become a
Indeed,
bit more tighter down the lines as more people go to Lib Dems in order to try and get rid of Reform?
I think we're going to end up.
in certain
I think
areas.
I think as well we're going to end up with. I mean, the way that politics is going at the moment, with sort of the diversity of who people are voting for, we're probably going to end up with marginals of basically every conceivable colour in some places of the country before long. It's headed that way. By the way, Election Maps UK says Durham was already no overall control. Just when we were speaking about which
so in
Labour
that case,
councils were.
Doncaster will be the only place that Reform gains off of Labour then.
So, out of curiosity, would you say that if Reform does become one of the two main parties, do you think they will try to change the first past the post, or you think they'll keep it?
They'll change it
Yeah.
because electoral reform has been something Farage has been going on about for years at this point. He's been going on about electoral reform for as long as he's been anti-European Union.
Yeah. And I think to actually have a so-called, if Reform does indeed become like a main party, as we've termed the Labour and the Tories in the past, and they are actually one advocating for electoral reform, you can add them to the Lib Dems and all of the other minor parties. Obviously, Labour and the Tories have always been opposed to it, but actually the Labour membership is in favour of it. It's just the higher ups that have never wanted to adopt it. So I feel that political gravity is probably moving towards that sooner or later. I want to do a few more
The ironic
comments.
thing is that for the longest time, Labour was actually in favour of electoral reform, and it was more or less a mainstream position in the party when they were in their wilderness years during the Thatcher Major era. They only turned against electoral reform once they won a massive majority in 1997, and ever since then, it's become more of a thing where the membership is in favour of electoral reform, but the party higher ups are not. And that view has only continued to be reinforced.
I'm losing you, Tom.
It's only continued to be reinforced by these electoral results because, as you can see in places like West of England, mayoralty, Labour can basically only win with first past the post because if these results had been done by PR, they would have lost a lot more support than they are losing now.
It's that shift, isn't it? That Turkey's not wanting to vote for Christmas. Labour and the Tories are happy to defend first past the post because it benefited them and solidified their positions within the system. But actually, if it ends up becoming the case that they get dislodged and suddenly they start they start ending up on the sharp side of first past the post, then maybe they'll finally change tack on that one. I want to do a few more comments quickly. So Liberty Prime says, +1 to the academic agent days. Was always fun watching you as the token lefty on that crazy show. Frank says, Ogum the Bold is a bot. No, yes, Ogum the Bold is a bot. And he is a beloved, a benevolent bot that we enjoy having here in the chat. Apollo says, I'd say my views are no similar to Corbyn on, I'm assuming no different, probably. To Corbyn on the NHS and nationalisation, to Tugendhat on defence spending, and to Farage on migration. This is the thing, Apollo. I think me and you share this in a sense that although kind of, you're on the right or centre right, I'm on the left or centre left, actually we've got enough of a combination of views in what we want that it is kind of spread out across a few different parties and the like. I could imagine actually, Apollo, that me and you could quite happily sit within the same hypothetical party if we were to invent one. We'd probably agree on quite a few things, but we just tend to go different places to try and find the things that we're looking for. Shockwave says, I was a Tory, then went Reform Brexit. Now I'm just fed up. If I could change my vote, I'd have voted for Corbyn. Blue Guy says, a Blue Guy is the least right wing in the chat. Who would have thought? Iron Hill is here and says, hi, comrades. Last time I was here, Theresa May was dancing on stage. Edward says, I think the most scathing meme was a Simpsons "Can't somebody else do it" one. Yes, that rings a bell. that rings a bell, actually. All in good jest from your JC supporting days. I also voted Jeremy Corbyn twice for different reasons. My God. Everyone in the chat's reform and everyone in the chat's voting Jeremy Corbyn. What's going on? Let me skim ahead here, try and catch up. Iron Hill always enjoyed both the general and local election streams back in the day. Electoral reform was part of Labour's 1997 platform with Jenkins. Edward says, as I said in the Guardian comments recently, Labour and the left in general need to get more sensible immigration levels, while neo-Thatcherite Tory boyfarage is all they have to worry about. IRL conversations and murmurings point to much worse if the establishment don't sort it. That I would agree, and I'm interested to know the views of you two as well, because I know that we have been talking about, you know, the right or wrong response of Labour to reform, and whether or not rightwards shifts in certain areas are seen as seeding ground to reform in a way that shouldn't be done because it ultimately won't benefit them. But I would say on the issue of immigration specifically, and obviously wanting lower immigration is generally seen as a thing of the right rather than the left in contemporary politics. But nonetheless, I'd say that is probably a very pragmatic and actually quite widely agreed upon thing. I think there's a general consensus out there in the country that we should have less immigration than we presently have. Obviously, as you get further and further towards the right, probably then gradually drifts in a bit more of a racial or cultural element towards people being different from us. But broadly, at least, just in terms of sort of numbers and service infrastructure and all the rest of it, I think getting a grip on the very high levels of immigration and lowering it is a very sensible thing that really Labour would benefit from taking quite seriously now. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree, but I'm interested on your thoughts.
I would say that my view on the whole immigration thing basically boils down to this. I won't.
Tom? Has he muted himself?
Uh-oh. He's been silenced. Oh, he's gone. He's cut out.
Well, in terms of immigration, I think it's like people thinking, okay, there's clearly need to be something done with immigration, but how you do it, I think, depends. The right-wing one, the more extreme right-wing ones want to boot out all immigrants. Let's see, you probably got like most people probably want wouldn't mind immigrants coming in, but like not like illegal ones at the very least. But so I think at the general, I think the most moderate people in terms of immigration would still want more immigrants coming in, but only if they're like illegal, and illegal ones get booted out. And then there'll be like ones that want both illegal and legal immigration. Both gone, but some might just want less legal immigration and no illegal immigration. I think that's what you kind of get in some sense of the political spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from from both of our experience within the Corbynite left in years past, I think there certainly was a strain of thought in some parts of the left that was very, very opposed to the idea of any sorts of controls of immigration. You know, the people that were profoundly I don't know what word I'm trying to look for. I don't know if anti-nationalist is the right word, but there were some people on the left who considered even the concept of being opposed to a certain level of immigration or enforcing borders as being something that was inherently racist, because maybe their view was a much more internationalist kind of, we ought to view everyone as being the same and everyone as looking after everyone in the same kind of a way. But I do think that is probably that's probably actually still a bit of a fringe view within the wider public. I don't even think it's necessarily the dominant view on the wider left.
Oh, Swiss, Tom's back.
Oh, is Tom back? Okay. Let me bring Tom back in. Hello there, Tom. We lost you.
Hello again. My apologies there. Internet cut out. But yeah, anyway, with the immigration thing, my position on this has generally changed quite over the years. Prior to the COVID era, I would say that I generally didn't really care about immigration one way or the other. It was never really an issue that I cared about or focused on that much. But when you look at the way immigration is right now, it's very clear that it's far too high. Um, our infrastructure and our housing just simply cannot cope with the huge numbers that we have coming in. And immigration does need to be reduced in some form. If you wanted me to be pinned onto a certain number, I would say that net migration of about 100,000, 200,000 a year is generally the sweet spot of that immigration level, because with the way our country's birth rate is, because of how low it is, if we had immigration at that level, after a few years, our population would slowly stabilize and probably even decline, and we could have infrastructure and housing keep up with our population demands. But at the moment, it's just not sustainable with the way we're doing things at the moment. But what I will say is, I do think that a lot of the immigration discussion that goes on these days is obscenely toxic to insane degrees,
I,
and
I
I
almost, I almost, sorry, go on.
I mean, and I'm of the opinion that there are right ways to discuss immigration as a political issue, and I do think it should be talked about. But I also think there are wrong ways to discuss it, and I think that a lot of people go way too far with it when they talk about this issue.
Yeah,
And oftentimes you have a situation where you go from somebody who is who has valid concerns about immigration numbers and the state of and the ability for the country's infrastructure to meet the demands of its population, and then you have people who just go all the way into full blown out and out xenophobia and are just open about that fact. And I do think that it is possible to have a discussion about immigration without being a xenophobe.
yes, and I think that probably especially sort of coming from the left, it's a thing that has felt almost sort of stifled or stigmatized to discuss, or at least it felt like that more so maybe 10 or so years ago. I almost feel as if sort of immigration became the original or one of the first culture wars issues, in the sense that it's one of those debates that always seemed to be getting really toxic, and there were you'd have these two extreme camps that shouted the loudest about it, and everyone else in the middle sort of went, oh Christ, I don't really want to be part of either of that bunch. Somewhere in between the internationalist open borders, we're all human beings, and the ethno-nationalist, we just want the whites here. Somewhere in between that, you can find a sensible policy, maybe.
Let's see. Arguably, I think the best. This might be the most best take a party could probably do with in terms of migration. Is like, say, moderate migration, where you still allow legal migrants to come in to do work, possibly either long-term commitment or just let's see, even just like temporary, and then head back to their country as soon as they're done and all that stuff. But and maybe some sort of diplomatic relations as a result of that. Keep those ones, but it's in terms of like illegal ones not allowed, and maybe any migrant that, let's see, causes a crime will be deported back to their country or something.
I think that
I, I,
generally lines up with what most of the public
yeah,
think about immigration in general.
I, I, and I think it's in a practice of fairness of the rules that we apply to people coming here are the same rules that we think would be fair enough applied to us if we went elsewhere. If I went to live in some other country and then I started going around committing a bunch of crimes, I think it'd be reasonable enough if that country sent me back to England. So probably vice versa is fair enough also.
Yeah, I think part of what drove the immigration debate to become as toxic as it did in a lot of ways is mainly because a lot of what was said about the promises of immigration, about like it supporting the elderly population and leading to continuous economic growth, none of that ever really came true in the end. Like, our demands for our elderly population have only continued to grow, and our social care bill and welfare bill has also only continued to grow despite continued high levels of immigration. And we also didn't ever really get any kind of economic growth that we were promised. I mean, Britain's economy, when you look at the stats, has experienced economic stagnation, which is on par with, or in many ways worse than a country like Japan, which has very low amount of immigration and also a very low birth rate and is seeing its population decrease by 1 million a year. So the fact that that has happened shows that a lot of the immigration promises never ended up bearing fruit in the end. And I think that led a lot of people to shift really hard in one direction as a sort of backlash of kinds to it.
But at the same time, it is also worth mentioning that the way our country currently operates and the nature of the workforce at the moment, if it weren't for a lot of the immigrant labour that we currently have, then we'd have very large gaps in certain. I'm thinking like the NHS, for example, and others.
Oh yeah. So the biggest problem is that if you want to reduce more long-term, I guess you could say, legal migration that we need, you're going to need to build infrastructure and things that will eventually create a workforce that can replace the need for migration. Biggest problem is none of the parties want to actually do that because of the time, money, and resources it would take.
It's
And that
just
probably
a
also
typical
includes
short
reform.
termism that you see from British political parties where they always choose the easiest option and take the easy way out instead of doing a more difficult solution that may be more effective. You mentioned NHS before. A lot of the issues with the NHS and why it's so heavily dependent upon migrant labour doesn't really come as a result of the government, but more from an organisation called the British Medical Association, also known as the
Oh,
BMA.
louder, please, Tom.
Oh, okay. It comes mostly from an organisation called the British Medical Association, or the BMA, which is the reason why we are so dependent on migrant labour for our health service, because what they have done is they have made the government cap artificially the number of doctors and nurses that are allowed to be trained in universities and in healthcare settings in general. I do not have a clue why this.
Oh, Tom, I've lost you again.
Okay, I don't have any idea why this cap exists from the BMA, but it does, and it drives the main reason as to why we're so dependent upon migrant labour for the NHS. It's the fault of the BMA, not the government per se.
I've got a comment here. Slight change of topic. King Alaska asks. Oh, I'm getting an echo from somebody. I think it's from you, Tom. Oh, thank you. Yeah, if you don't mind muting just when you're not talking, appreciated. King Alaska here says, do you think this is a one-term government?
My
My short
man,
answer for
I've
you.
been, my man,
My
I've been
short
saying
answer,
that.
probably.
Okay, I mean, my man, I've been saying that this is a one-term government even before they got elected. Like, you can go back on this channel to the stream the day that Rishi Sunak called the election, and you'll find me in there saying that this is a one-term government. Like, I've been saying that this is going to be a one-term government before they even got elected. So yeah, this is a one-term government. That's the position I had back when the election was called almost a year ago now. And it's the position that I have kept all throughout this time.
There might have been a chance it could have become two-term government, even if it's like a minority government. But I think over the last couple of months, they have probably killed any chances of that happening.
I'd say that my view, I think it was round about Christmas, maybe it was the beginning of December, was when I first said I thought that we were on track for Farage in Downing Street. And there hasn't really been an awful lot to dislodge that view. In fact, aside from a slight wobble I had on that maybe a month or so ago when reform started to dip a little bit, if anything, these local elections have reinforced that idea that reform's here to stay, and they've got some serious momentum behind them. So it's not guaranteed, it's not pinned on. There's an awful lot that can change in the course of the next few years, but certainly the current trajectory, if Labour remain unpopular and not being seen to deliver for the country, then it makes very good sense that the public are going to be voting for an alternative come the next general election.
Yeah, Dan has said in here 4 years left yet. 4 years ago today in the 2021 locals, we said Boris would win 3 general elections. I don't think I made that argument back then, to be fair, but I can't remember if I did or not. But the difference is, as I'd say, is that doesn't that kind of prove Starmer to be in a much worse position? Because back then, Boris was in government in a favourable position, and then he ended up doing badly later on down the line. If Starmer's in government and he's already at a low position now, then that kind of indicates that they're in not a great position long term either.
I think
I
at the very least, you predicted that Labour would not win the next general election and Boris might become Prime Minister for at least 10 years.
I think I said that after the 2019 election, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think that's what you said.
I think then the lesson that we can learn is to say that even if things appear very clearly in a certain direction at one point in time, you can't anticipate what events are going to come along to change things. You only have to look at the Canadian election with the fate of the Liberals. You know, it seemed absolutely nailed on that the Liberals were going to lose after the Justin Trudeau premiership, and then events, my dear boy, events came along, and suddenly there they are in power again. So I think all we can do is make guesses based on where we presently are and where we reasonably expect things to go. But God knows all kinds of events can come along to shift things.
To be fair, with the Canada Liberals example, I don't think anybody expected the President of the United States to come out and be like, Canada should be a part of the US and shouldn't exist as a sovereign state. Like, I don't think that's something anybody could have predicted he would say, nor did anybody predict that the Canadians would have such a harsh reaction to it in response. I mean, had Trump just stayed quiet and said nothing about Canada and maintains the status quo relationship that existed between the two, Conservatives would have won that election. But Trump just had to screw it up. So unless Trump is like, oh, the UK should be the 51st state of America, I'm not too sure the Canada example really works for the UK. One example I do think that'll back my point up is actually Germany and Olaf Scholz. Like, Olaf Scholz and the SPD ended up being a one-term government in the end, despite having quite a strong mandate when they got elected back in 2021. It ultimately didn't matter in the end. They collapsed, and CDU, after 16 years of Angela Merkel's rule, ended up back in government again after 4 years.
I'll just go back to the point I made a moment ago, which is just that we can make predictions and assessments on where things appear that they're going to go, and sometimes they follow through, and sometimes events come along to change it. I'm not suggesting that we will have an equivalent of Donald Trump going after the UK the same as they went against Canada, but in the Canada specific example, that was something that happened for them. For us, say, I suppose you could say, like, how poorly the Tories were doing under Theresa May during the Brexit years, and then Boris came along and completely turned that around and got a majority that people hadn't necessarily seen coming maybe only a year before that. So I'm not saying that it's an impossibility for Labour to win another term. Is there the scope that within the next few years things could improve and they could be in power again at the next election? Yes, I think it's absolutely possible. It's just we've just kind of got to make guesstimates based on where we appear to be currently, and where we appear to be currently is Reform have a lot of momentum, Labour are very unpopular and not delivering. So unless something shifts within that dynamic, then that's where we're headed for the time being. By the way, popped up. Oh, sorry, I'll come to you in just a sec. Boriak popped up in the chat, and I've not read one of your comments yet, and said if Labour get a new leader, they might turn it around somewhat.
That was
go on,
kind of what I was kind of suggesting. If Labour possibly replaced Starmer with someone that was actually at least somewhat competent, at the very least, they might do better than whatever the results are now, at least. I mean, not sure if they would guarantee a win, but it could at least minimize the damage they're getting now.
I think though it would have to be on the matter of delivering. It would have to be on the matter of implementing policies. Can they improve the economy? Can they lower immigration? Can they build more houses? Can they improve the state of the health service? All of these things. That'll be the measuring stick by which the public looks at things, I think. Election Maps optimistically says we could be mid-nuclear winter by then. Well, if we're lucky. I have no idea how things will go. Guys, we are at 6 p.m. in the evening, and we've been streaming for over 3 hours here. We have 18 out of the 23 councils announced. I'm feeling comfortable enough to look to wrap up the stream. I feel that yes, we've got a few more results left to go, but I think we've got a pretty good read of where things are going in these local elections now. I think that Reform are absolutely going to end up breaching 600 councillors, maybe even approaching towards 700 when all is said and done. Labour are still yet to surpass 100. But I think, by the looks of it, they may just about manage to clear themselves of being overtaken by the Greens. Tories probably will end up over 300 by the end of things. Lee Hallam says we outlasted the BBC. Well, hey ho, there we go. If the BBC gave up it up before we did, then that's something to be proud of, I suppose. Apollo TD says, any plans to stream tomorrow? I've got a few things on tomorrow. I'm not sure. What I will say is that within the next few days, at the very least, some point in the weekend or Monday at the very latest, I'll come back for sort of like a final, assessment of the local elections. Once we finally got all the results, and I can have a good old listen to what John Curtis has to say about things, or anyone else I view quite knowledgeable on that, I'll come back and we can sort of kind of finally paint a big picture of the whole result and say where we think things are at, and we might have a little read on what the reactions and of like the Tories and Labour are. Let the dust settle, as Lee Hallam says, exactly. So yeah, I'll be back within the next few days to sort of have a recap on everything and see where we're at. I think that's probably the plan.
All right.
And I'll read a few more comments from the guys before we go. Spycatcher BBC says, I've enjoyed sharing this day with you chaps. See you again in the future. Cheers, ta-ta. Thank you very much. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe. And Lossie Lotsnitzer says, well done, guys. Good stream. I was never expecting to listen to a lefty panel. Thank you. There we are. That's what we do best, I suppose. And finally, I'll also read from Average Joe. I could only see Starmer turn his fortunes around with a rally around the flag of Russia suddenly attacking NATO and the Baltics or something like that. Starmer's best ratings were his Ukraine leader meetings. Very fair point there. Last few ones. Frank says, go on. Do you want to reply on that? And then I will wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to reply to Joe. I mean, yeah, I'm of the same opinion at this stage. I think that the only way that Starmer can really recover the situation at this point is if you have an event like a Russia-NATO war that leads to a rally around the flag effect. But, well, I mean, at that stage, we'll be not really worrying about what Doncaster County Council election results are going to be. There's that. But no, I mean, I really just don't see it at this stage. Like, there is a general trend of centre-left parties like Olaf Scholz, like Joe Biden, like Emmanuel Macron, and so many other people just getting thrashed completely because They underpromise and even bigger underdeliver. And the other thing as well is they just don't have good vibes or a good story or a good narrative. So much of politics these days is really just driven by vibes and narratives. And when your leader is a guy who is so uncharismatic that he makes John Major look like Barack Obama, I mean, where's your positive vibes going to come from? Where's your grand narrative and vision for the country and the party? It's just not there.
Yeah. Starmer has always struggled with, as they call it, the vision thing, and I think that's very much been to his detriment. Right, the last few ones I'll do here. Frank says, thanks, Swiss. Can't wait to see you live again. These streams have been great. Thank you very much. Average Joe says, the tricky thing for Labour is most economists and experts don't see any bright spots for the global or UK economy over the next few years. And Apollo says, we'll have to do that stream on the British right soon, Swiss soon. Absolutely, Apollo. I'm sorry you weren't able to come on today. It would have been nice to chat to you, but I'm well up for having you on at some point, and you can talk to me about the Conservatives and Reform, and we'll see if I can better understand exactly what the interplay is between them there. Right then, John, Tom, thank you very much for joining me for what's been quite a marathon 24 hours or so of British electoral politics.
Done about 10 hours of local coverage.
Yes, but the good news is it's only Friday, so we've all got a lovely weekend to enjoy.
Yep.
It's the
I
bank
hope...
holiday one as well, because it's May Day on the 5th.
Oh yes, you see, look, I've been quite lucky because I booked today off work so I could do the election stream last night, and I've got work off. I'm off on Monday for the bank holiday, so I've got a 4-day weekend right now. So I'm living my
Basically,
best
for me,
life.
it's a 5-day week because I went to Canvas. Sorry, go on.
Well, no, happy days for the lot of us then. Right then, right. No, I'm always right. New viewers to the channel, if you've joined us in these elections, one thing you will come to learn very quickly is that I will say that I'm going to end the stream, and then I take a very, very long time to actually end the stream. When we were talking about the ways that politicians lie, this is one of Captain Swiss's greatest lies. He says we're wrapping up in 5 minutes, and then we don't. But I shall go. Anyway, thank you very much, folks, for joining us. I'll see you all again soon. Please do drop the stream a like. Catch you later on. Ta-ta.
Bye, everyone.